The gallows loomed against the midnight sky, a dark silhouette that seemed to drink in the moonlight. A gentle breeze stirred the hanging rope, causing it to sway like a pendulum, counting down the moments of a life soon to end. In the distance, an owl's haunting call pierced the silence, its melancholy echo rolling across the hills of Sundown Valley. Clara Hammond stood motionless on the wooden platform, her wrists bound before her. The rough hemp of her Sunday dress scratched against her skin, a stark contrast to the fine fabrics she usually worked with her skilled hands. At 19, she held herself with a dignity that belied her years, her dark eyes fixed not on the crowd gathered below, but on the distant hills where a small figure watched from the shadows. Sheriff Tate adjusted the noose with practiced hands. "Any last words, girl?" he asked, his voice betraying neither sympathy nor malice. Clara remained silent, her gaze never leaving the hillside. She would not give them the satisfaction of hearing her plead. She would not have her brother Daniel witness such weakness. Thaddeus Simmons, the town clerk, unrolled a yellowed parchment. "Clara Hammond," he read, his reedy voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "you have been found guilty of horse theft in the murder of Jacob Miller. By the authority vested in Mayor Harrison Wells in the Town Council of Sundown Valley, you are hereby sentenced to hang by the neck until dead." Mayor Wells stepped forward, his imposing figure cutting a sharp silhouette against the torchlight. His silver pocket watch glinted as he removed it from his vest. "Let justice be done," he announced, his deep voice rippling through the night air. He nodded to the executioner. The black-hooded man moved toward the lever that would open the trap door beneath Clara's feet. The crowd held its collective breath. A woman sobbed quietly. Someone whispered a prayer. But before the executioner could pull the lever, a voice thundered across the square. "Hold!" The crowd parted like a sea as a tall figure strode forward. Mason Ridge moved with the deliberate gait of a man who had faced death many times and no longer feared its shadow. His weather-beaten face was a map of scars and wrinkles, each line telling a story of hardship and survival. The eagle feather tied in his gray hair caught the moonlight as he approached the gallows. "This execution will not proceed," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. Sheriff Tate's hand dropped to his holster. "This ain't your business, Ridge. When an innocent girl faces the noose without a proper trial, it becomes everyone's business." Mason's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, surveyed the crowd before settling on Mayor Wells. "Or have the good people of Sundown Valley abandon all pretense of justice?" Mayor Wells stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled anger. The evidence was clear. The girl was caught red-handed with my prize stallion. Jacob Miller's blood was still warm when we found her. Evidence gathered without witnesses, judged without a trial. Mason climbed the steps of the gallows, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat. "I demand a proper hearing for this girl." "On what grounds?" Wells challenged. Mason now stood beside Clara, his presence a fortress against the night. "On the grounds that she saved my life 3 weeks ago when I lay dying of fever in the mountains. A thief and murderer doesn't risk her life to save a stranger." He turned to address the gathered townspeople. "Does a community that prides itself on Christian values condemn a young woman without allowing her to speak in her own defense?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several women exchanged uncertain glances. A few men removed their hats, suddenly uncomfortable with the spectacle before them. Mayor Wells's jaw tightened. "The law in Sundown Valley is clear." "The law," Mason interrupted, "demands a fair trial. I'm willing to stake my own life on her innocence." He placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "Give her 3 days for a proper hearing. If she's still found guilty, I'll hang in her place." A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Even Clara turned to stare at the weathered man beside her, shock momentarily breaking through her stoic facade. Sheriff Tate looked to the mayor, awaiting instruction. For a long moment, Wells stood silent, his calculating eyes moving between Mason and Clara. Finally, he gave a curt nod. 3 days, he agreed, his voice cold as winter stone. "But the girl remains in custody." "She'll stay with me," Mason countered. "I'll be responsible for her." Before Wells could object, Reverend Abernathy stepped forward from the crowd. The elderly pastor had been watching the proceedings with growing discomfort, his gnarled hands clutching his Bible. "If I may, Mayor Wells," he said, his voice frail but determined, "the good book teaches us mercy. A brief delay to ensure justice seems a small price for our community's soul." Wells knew opposing the Reverend publicly would cost him support. With a barely concealed sneer, he conceded. 3 days, Ridge, not 1 hour more. And if she tries to run, she won't, Mason stated with absolute certainty. As Sheriff Tate reluctantly removed the noose from around Clara's neck, a figure at the edge of the crowd caught Mason's attention. Ezra Johnson, the town blacksmith, stood watching with intense, knowing eyes. The former slave gave an almost imperceptible nod to Mason before melting back into the dispersing crowd. Clara stumbled slightly as she descended the gallows steps, her legs numb from standing so long. Mason's steady hand on her elbow kept her upright. As they walked away from the shadow of the gallows, she whispered, "Why would you risk your life for me? You barely know me." Mason's reply was equally quiet. "Some debts can never be fully repaid, Miss Hammond, and some injustices cannot go unchallenged." As they passed through the murmuring crowd, Clara kept her gaze forward, her back straight despite the weight of stairs. Only when they reached the edge of town did she allow herself one glance back at the distant hills. The small figure was gone. 1 week earlier, Clara Hammond ran through the forest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The moonless night cloaked the woods in perfect darkness, but her feet knew these paths as intimately as the lines on her palm. Behind her, the thunder of hoofbeats grew louder. Clutched to her chest was a small package wrapped in oilskin, its contents more precious than gold. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she veered off the trail, ducking beneath low-hanging branches and scrambling over fallen logs. The voices of her pursuers carried on the night air. "She went this way. Don't let her get away." Clara's foot caught on an exposed root, sending her sprawling. The package flew from her grasp, landing in a patch of moonlight that filtered through the canopy. As she scrambled to retrieve it, the oilskin unwrapped, revealing an aged leather journal. A single page had fallen open, exposing handwritten words that gleamed in the silvery light, the truth about Sundown Valley. With trembling hands, Clara snatched up the journal and continued her flight. The woods grew denser, the underbrush clawing at her skirts. Her lungs burned, but she pressed on until she reached the hollow trunk of an ancient oak, a childhood hiding place. She squeezed inside just as the riders thundered past their lanterns, casting eerie, dancing shadows through the forest. Clara pressed herself deeper into the tree's embrace, clutching the journal to her chest as if it were her own beating heart. Only when the sounds of pursuit had faded completely did she allow herself to breathe normally again. She opened the journal once more, tracing her fingers over her mother's elegant handwriting. Sarah Hammond had been gone for a year now, but in these pages her voice lived on. "I'm sorry, Mama," Clara whispered to the silent forest. "I couldn't leave it behind, not when it might tell me why you died." The chirping of crickets was her only answer. When dawn painted the eastern sky with strokes of gold and pink, Clara emerged from her hiding place. She moved cautiously through the awakening forest, the journal safely tucked inside her dress. Her modest cabin came into view, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Daniel must have kept the fire going all night. The thought of her 9-year-old brother alone and worried sent a pang through her chest. She quickened her pace. The cabin door flew open before she reached it. Daniel burst out, his small face alight with relief and fear. "Clara," he cried, launching himself into her arms. "I thought they got you." She held him tight, burying her face in his tousled hair that smelled of pine smoke and sleep. "I'm all right, little Fau," she assured him, using the nickname their mother had given him. "I just had to retrieve something important." Daniel pulled back his eyes, so like her own, searching her face. "Was it Mama's book, the one you said was hidden at the big house?" Clara nodded, then glanced around anxiously. "Let's go inside. It's not safe to talk out here." Their cabin was small but meticulously kept. Clara had hung bright woven blankets on the walls to keep out drafts and add color to their modest home. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the single room with earthy, comforting scents. A pot of porridge bubbled over the hearth fire. "You made breakfast," Clara said, smiling at her brother's thoughtfulness. Daniel shrugged, though pride flickered across his features. "You said you'd be back by morning. I knew you'd be hungry." As they ate their simple meal, Clara recounted her night's adventure, carefully editing the more frightening details. Daniel listened wide-eyed, his spoon forgotten in his bowl. "Did you read it yet?" he asked when she finished. "What secrets does it have?" Clara touched the journal, which now lay on the table between them. "Not yet. I was too busy staying ahead of Wells' men." She paused, considering. But I think it might tell us why Mama died in that fire, and why Mayor Wells is so determined to drive us out of Sundown Valley. Daniel's expression darkened. Though young, he understood all too well the precarious position they occupied in the town's social order. As children of a Cherokee mother and a white father who had died in the war, they existed in a liminal space neither fully accepted by the white community nor connected to their mother's people. "Will it be dangerous?" Daniel asked, his voice small but determined. Reading what's inside, Clara met his gaze steadily. "Truth often is little fox, but Mama always said it's better to face a dangerous truth than live with a comfortable lie." Daniel nodded solemnly. "Then we should read it together." Clara reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "First, I need to check on Black Wind." Black Wind was a magnificent stallion belonging to Mayor Wells. A horse with a bloodline as impressive as its temperament was difficult. 3 days ago, Clara had found the animal tangled in barbed wire near Crow Creek, its leg badly gashed and festering. Using the herbal knowledge passed down from her mother, she had treated the wound and kept the horse hidden in an abandoned trapper's cabin while it healed. Today, she planned to return Black Wind to Wells's stables before anyone realized her involvement. The mayor was known for his swift and merciless punishment of those who interfered with his property. "Can I come with you?" Daniel asked, already knowing the answer. Clara shook her head. "Too risky. I need you to stay here and keep our home safe." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small carved wooden fox. "Keep this with you. If anyone comes looking for me, hide in our special place and don't come out until you hear our whistle." Daniel took the fox figurine, running his fingers over its smooth surface. Their father had carved it for him before leaving for the war, one of the few mementos they had of the man whose face grew dimmer in their memories with each passing year. "I'll be careful," Clara promised, kissing the top of his head, "and I'll be back before sundown." She changed into her work dress, a simple practical garment she had sewn herself, and packed a small satchel with herbal remedies for Black Wind's leg. As she prepared to leave, she hesitated, then returned to the table where her mother's journal lay. After a moment's consideration, she wrapped it in a clean cloth and tucked it beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. Some truths were better explored when one had time to absorb their full impact. The summer day grew hot as Clara made her way to the trapper's cabin. Cicadas droned in the trees and the distant mountains shimmered in the heat haze. She moved cautiously, taking little-used paths and staying within the tree line whenever possible. Black Wind nickered softly when she entered the cabin. The stallion's dark coat gleamed with health, and the wound on its leg had nearly healed, a testament to her mother's medical knowledge. "Hello, handsome," Clara murmured, approaching with gentle confidence. She examined the leg, pleased with its progress. "Time to take you home, though I doubt you'll receive such tender care there." She fed the horse an apple from her pocket, then prepared it for the journey back to town. As she worked, she spoke softly to the animal, explaining her plan to return it to Wells's stable under a cover of darkness. "Your master would never believe I was helping you," she told the horse as she checked its saddle. "He'd sooner believe I was stealing you. Men like Harrison Wells don't understand kindness without motive." Black Wind snorted as if in agreement. By late afternoon, Clara had led the horse to the edge of the forest overlooking Sundown Valley. From her vantage point, she could see the town spread below the church steeple, the main street with its storefronts, and on the northern edge, the imposing Wells mansion with its stables and manicured grounds. She would wait for nightfall before approaching. For now, she settled beneath an old oak tree, sharing a simple meal of cornbread and dried venison with Black Wind. As the stallion grazed nearby, Clara found her thoughts returning to her mother's journal. Sarah Hammond had been more than just a loving mother. She had been the keeper of old ways, a healer, whose knowledge of plants and their medicinal properties had been passed down through generations of Cherokee women. Though the white residents of Sundown Valley often sought her remedies in secret, they publicly maintained their distance, especially after Harrison Wells became mayor 5 years ago. The fire that claimed Sarah's life had been declared an accident, a cooking fire that spread to the thatched roof while she slept. But Clara had never believed it. Her mother had been too careful, too respectful of fire's power. And then there were the footprints Clara had found in the soft earth around their old cabin the morning after the blaze, footprints too large to belong to either her or Daniel. The sun began its descent behind the western mountains, painting the valley in hues of amber and gold. Clara rose, brushing pine needles from her skirt. It was time. She led Black Wind down the hillside, staying within the shadows of the tree line. The town grew quiet as the evening approached, with most residents retiring to their homes for supper. Only the saloon showed signs of activity, yellow lamplights spilling from its windows, along with bursts of raucous laughter. Clara circled behind the buildings, making her way toward the Wells estate. The mansion stood like a sentinel on the edge of town, its white columns gleaming in the twilight. Behind it lay the stables where Wells kept his prized horses' animals, more for show than practical use. She paused at the edge of the estate, scanning for any sign of guards or stable hands. Seeing none, she led Black Wind across the open ground, her heart thundering in her chest. The stable door creaked slightly as she eased it open. The scent of hay and horse enveloped her as she led the stallion inside. Other horses stirred in their stalls, but none made enough noise to cause alarm. "Home safe," Clara whispered, guiding Black Wind into his stall. She quickly removed the saddle and bridle, then gave the horse one final check. "Your legs should heal completely now. Just don't tell anyone who helped you." As she turned to leave, a floorboard creaked behind her. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. "Well, well," came a deep voice from the shadows. "What have we here?" Jacob Miller Wells's head stableman stepped into view, a lantern held high in one hand. His other hand rested on the handle of a knife at his belt. "Mr. Miller," Clara acknowledged, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I was just returning the mayor's horse." "Returning," Miller's laugh was cold. "That's a new name for stealing." "I wasn't stealing him," Clara protested. "I found him injured by Crow Creek 3 days ago. I've been treating his wound." She gestured to Blackwind's leg. "See for yourself." Miller held the lantern closer, examining the nearly healed gash. His eyebrows rose in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned. That's fine doctoring." His expression hardened again. "But you still took the mayor's property without permission. He's been searching for that horse for days." "I was only trying to help," Clara said, edging toward the door. "I'm returning him now, good as new. Surely the mayor will understand." Miller blocked her path. "The mayor doesn't much care for your kind interfering with his business, healing hands or no." His eyes narrowed. "But perhaps we could come to an arrangement, you and I." The way his gaze traveled over her made Clara's skin crawl. She took a step back. "I should go. My brother is waiting for me." "Your brother can wait a little longer." Miller moved closer, backing her against the stall door. "Pretty thing, like you shouldn't be so unfriendly." Clara's hand closed around a metal curry comb hanging nearby. "Please step aside, Mr. Miller." He reached for her arm. "Now don't be difficult." Clara swung the curry comb, striking him across the temple. Miller staggered back, more surprised than hurt. His surprise quickly turned to rage. "You'll regret that half-breed," he snarled, drawing his knife. Clara darted past him, making for the door, but Miller caught her skirt, yanking her backward. She stumbled, falling hard onto the stable floor. The curry comb skittered away into the shadows. Miller loomed over her knife, glinting in the lantern light. "Nobody's going to miss a Cherokee bastard," he hissed. Clara scrambled backwards, searching desperately for anything to use as a weapon. Her hand closed around the handle of a pitchfork. But before she could raise it, Black Wind erupted from his stall with a furious whinny. The stallion reared, striking out with his front hooves. One connected with Miller's chest, sending the stableman flying backward. He crashed into a support beam, his knife clattering to the floor. Clara seized the opportunity, leaping to her feet and racing for the door. Behind her, she heard Miller cursing as he struggled to rise. She burst from the stable into the gathering darkness, running blindly across the estate grounds. She had nearly reached the tree line when a gunshot shattered the evening quiet. Clara froze, turning back toward the stable. A second shot rang out, followed by an agonized human scream that cut off abruptly. For a moment, she stood paralyzed with indecision. Then self-preservation took over. She plunged into the forest, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just heard. Someone had fired those shots. Someone had silenced Jacob Miller, and she, Clara Hammond, had just become the most convenient suspect. The cabin belonging to Mason Ridge sat high on a wooded ridge overlooking Sundown Valley. Built of solid pine logs and riverstone, it blended with the natural landscape as if it had grown there rather than being constructed by human hands. Clara sat on a rough-hewn bench on the porch, a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, still damp from washing away the jail's grime. Her wrists bore red marks where the ropes had bound her. Inside the cabin, she could hear Mason moving about, preparing a simple meal. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon drifted through the open door, making her stomach growl. She hadn't eaten properly in days. The events following her escape from Wells's stable remained a blur in her memory. She had run through the night, eventually making her way back to her own cabin at dawn, only to find it empty. Daniel was gone, their few possessions scattered, as if there had been a struggle. Before she could begin searching for her brother, Sheriff Tate and his deputies had arrived. They found her still clutching her mother's journal, which she had retrieved from its hiding place. The book was confiscated, and Clara was dragged to the town jail accused of stealing Black Wind and murdering Jacob Miller. No one believed her protests of innocence. No one listened when she asked about Daniel. 3 days later, she stood on the gallows, prepared to die until Mason Ridge appeared like a ghost from the shadows of her past. Now she sat on his porch, technically a free woman, for the next 3 days, yet still trapped in a web of accusations and mysteries. And somewhere out there, Daniel was waiting for her to find him. The cabin door creaked open and Mason emerged carrying 2 tin plates heaped with bacon, beans, and cornbread. He handed one to Clara without ceremony, then settled on the bench beside her. "Eat," he said simply. "You'll need your strength." But Clara didn't need to be told twice. She ate with the urgency of the truly hungry, barely pausing between bites. Mason ate more slowly, his weathered face unreadable in the gathering twilight. When she had finished, Clara set her empty plate aside. "Thank you," she said, the words encompassing both the meal and her rescue from the gallows. Mason acknowledged with a slight nod. "You have questions." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Clara studied him, taking in the deep lines etched around his eyes, the silver streaking his dark hair, the old scars that spoke of battles fought long ago. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "The truth this time." Mason's gaze remained fixed on the valley below, where the lights of sundown were beginning to twinkle like earthbound stars. "I told no lies on the gallows. You did save my life 3 weeks ago. But that's not the whole story." "No," he agreed, "it's not." Clara waited, sensing he would reveal more in his own time. The chirping of crickets filled the silence between them. Finally, Mason spoke again. "I knew your father, John Hammond. We fought together in the war." Clara's breath caught. Her father had been a presence, more felt than known, a soldier who had returned from the war long enough to marry her mother, Father Daniel, and then succumb to wounds that had never properly healed. "You knew my father," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason nodded. "He was a good man, brave, loyal to his friends." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Stubborn as the day is long when he believed in something." "How did you meet him?" "We were in the same regiment, fought at Gettysburg together." Mason's eyes took on a faraway look. "Your father saved my life there. Carried me off that battlefield with a mini-A ball in my leg and Confederate soldiers closing in." Clara absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the gentle, soft-spoken man she remembered. "He never talked much about the war." "Most who've seen its true face don't," Mason replied. "But he spoke often of your mother. And of you." He turned to look at her directly. He was proud of his Cherokee wife and his beautiful daughter. Said you had her healing hands and his stubborn spirit. Tears pricked at Clara's eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to show weakness. "If you were his friend, why didn't you come to us after he died? We could have used a friend these past years." A shadow passed over Mason's features. "I was away, hunting my own ghosts." He cleared his throat. "By the time I returned to these mountains, Sarah was gone and you and Daniel were making your own way." Clara sensed there was more to the story than he was sharing, but she had more pressing concerns. "Daniel," she said urgently, "my brother is missing. When they arrested me, he was gone from our cabin. I need to find him." "He's safe," Mason said, surprising her. "You know where he is?" Hope flared in Clara's chest. Mason nodded. "He's been here with me since the night you were arrested. The boy showed up on my doorstep after midnight, half frozen with fear. Said men had come to your cabin looking for something his mama had hidden." Relief washed over Clara like a cleansing rain. "Thank God," she breathed. "Can I see him?" "He's sleeping now. Best not to wake him." Mason's expression softened slightly. "The boy's had a rough few days, but he's strong like his sister." Clara felt some of the tension leave her body for the first time in days. Daniel was safe, for now that was enough. "Tomorrow," Mason continued, We begin gathering evidence to prove your innocence. Wells and his men won't make it easy. They've already searched your cabin thoroughly looking for something. My mother's journal, Clara said. They took it when they arrested me. Mason's eyes sharpened with interest. What was in it? Clara hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But if this man had truly been her father's friend, if he was risking his life to save hers, perhaps he deserved the truth. I'm not entirely sure, she admitted. I only recently found it hidden in our old cabin, the one that burned with my mother inside. I hadn't had time to read much, but… She paused, choosing her words carefully. I believe it contains information about Mayor Wells. Information he doesn't want known. What kind of information? I don't know exactly, but the night before she died, my mother told me that not everything in Sundown Valley was as it appeared, that some men wore masks to hide their true faces. Clara drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The next day she was dead, and within a week Wells had seized our land claiming unpaid taxes. Mason absorbed this information in silence. The darkness had deepened around them, the forest coming alive with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush. We'll need that journal, he said finally, but first you need rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough. He showed her to a small side room where Daniel lay curled in a narrow bed, his small face peaceful in sleep. Clara's heart constricted at the sight of him. She brushed a lock of hair from his forehead, then bent to kiss his cheek. Sleep well, little fox, she whispered. Later, lying on a pallet near the hearth, Clara stared into the dying embers of the fire. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Too many questions swirled in her mind. Why had Wells framed her for Miller's murder? What secrets had her mother uncovered? And could she trust Mason Ridge, this stranger who claimed friendship with her father yet had been absent all these years? She turned these questions over and over until fatigue finally claimed her, pulling her down into a dreamless sleep. Morning came with a cheerful chorus of birdsong and the delicious aroma of coffee. Clara woke to find Daniel sitting cross-legged beside her pallet, his dark eyes bright with excitement. Clara, he exclaimed, throwing himself into her arms as soon as he saw she was awake. Mr. Ridge said you were here, but I had to see for myself. She hugged him fiercely, breathing in his familiar scent. I'm here, little foe, and I'm not going anywhere. Daniel pulled back, his expression suddenly serious. They said you killed a man, but I knew it wasn't true. Of course it wasn't, Clara assured him, smoothing his rumpled hair. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like Mama, Daniel asked, his voice small. The question caught Clara off guard. They rarely spoke of their mother's death, the pain still too raw. What do you mean? Daniel glanced toward the main room where they could hear Mason moving about. He lowered his voice. Mama wrote in her book that she was afraid, that she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see. Clara's heart quickened. You read the journal? Daniel nodded. Just a little before those men came. They were looking for it, Clara. They tore apart our whole cabin. What else did you read? Clara pressed, keeping her voice low. Something about Mayor Wells not being who he says he is, and about his wife knowing a secret. Daniel's brow furrowed in concentration. There was a name. Blackfeather, I think that was it. The name meant nothing to Clara, but she filed it away in her memory. You did well to remember, little phone, and even better to come find Mr. Ridge. He's nice, Daniel said with a child's simple assessment. He taught me to whittle yesterday. He produced a small, crudely carved horse from his pocket. See? Clara admired the carving with appropriate enthusiasm, though her mind was racing with the implications of what Daniel had told her. If her suspicions were correct, her mother had discovered something about Harrison Wells, something worth killing for. Come on, she said, rising from her pallet. Let's see what Mr. Ridge has planned for today. They found Mason in the main room stoking the fire. A pot of coffee bubbled on the hearth and a skillet of cornmeal mush waited on the table. He acknowledged their presence with a nod. Sleep well, he asked, pouring coffee into 3 tin cups. Well enough, Clara replied, accepting the cup. The strong, bitter brew helped clear the last cobwebs of sleep from her mind. Daniel tells me you have been teaching him to whittle. A hint of a smile touched Mason's weathered face. Boy's got a natural talent, just needs practice. Daniel beamed at the praise, helping himself to a generous portion of mush. As they ate their simple breakfast, Mason outlined his plan. First, we need to establish where you were when Miller was killed. The shots were heard around dusk. Anyone see you after that? Clara thought hard. No, I ran straight into the forest. I didn't see anyone until I reached our cabin at dawn. Mason frowned him. That's a problem. Without witnesses, it's your word against Wells's. What about the horse? Daniel piped up. Black Wind knows Clara helped him. Mason ruffled the boy's hair. If only horses could testify in court, son. He turned back to Clara. We need to find out who really killed Miller and why. My guess is it was Wells himself or someone working for him. Why would Wells kill his own stableman? Clara asked. Maybe Miller saw something he shouldn't have, or knew something dangerous. Mason drained his coffee cup. We also need to recover your mother's journal. That might hold the key to everything. It would be in Wells's study, Clara said. That's where the sheriff took all my possessions. Mason nodded. Getting into that house won't be easy, but I might know someone who can help. He rose from the table. For now, you two stay here. Keep the door locked and I'm going into town to speak with an old friend. After Mason left, Clara and Daniel spent the morning exploring the cabin and its surroundings. Despite the circumstances, Daniel's spirits were high. For him, this was an adventure, a temporary respite from the hardships of their normal life. Clara tried to maintain a cheerful demeanor for his sake, but her thoughts kept returning to the gallows and the 3-day deadline. If they couldn't prove her innocence by then, Mason would hang in her place. The thought was unbearable. By midday, she had made a decision. She couldn't sit idle while others risked themselves on her behalf. She needed to take action. Daniel, she said, kneeling to meet her brother's eyes, I need to go into town. His face fell. Mr. Ridge said to stay here. I know, but there's something I must do, something that might help clear my name. She squeezed his shoulders gently. You'll be safe here. Keep the door barred and don't open it for anyone but me or Mr. Ridge. Daniel looked unconvinced. What if those men come back? Clara pointed to a loose floorboard near the hearth. If you hear anyone approaching who isn't us, hide under there. Mr. Ridge showed me the space this morning. It's big enough for you to fit, and no one would think to look there. After extracting a solemn promise from Daniel to remain hidden, Clara set out for Sundown Valley. She moved cautiously through the forest, avoiding the main trail. The summer heat pressed down like a physical weight, causing sweat to trickle between her shoulder blades. As she neared the town, Clara circled around to approach from the north where the Wells mansion stood. She needed to speak with Eleanor Wells. Clara had known Eleanor since childhood. The mayor's wife had been a friend to Sarah Hammond, often visiting the cabin for tea and bringing cast-off fabrics for Clara's sewing projects. After Sarah's death, Eleanor had withdrawn, rarely venturing into town without her husband's escort. But Clara remembered the kindness in the older woman's eyes and the sadness. If anyone might help her now, it was Eleanor Wells. The mansion's gardens provided ample cover as Clara crept closer. Tall hedges and ornamental trees cast deep shadows in the afternoon sun. She made her way to the rear of the house, where the kitchen garden offered the best chance of finding Eleanor alone. Luck was with her. Eleanor knelt among the herb beds, a wicker basket beside her, as she harvested sprigs of rosemary and thyme. Her silver-streaked dark hair was pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and she hummed softly to herself as she worked. Clara hesitated, suddenly uncertain. What if Eleanor called for help? What if she truly believed the accusations against Clara? Before she could retreat, Eleanor looked up, her humming ceasing abruptly. Her blue eyes widened in shock. Clara Hammond, she whispered, glancing fearfully toward the house. Child, what are you doing here? They'll hang you if they find you. I need your help, Mrs. Wells, Clara said, remaining half hidden behind a lilac bush. I didn't kill Jacob Miller. I didn't steal Black Wind. I was just returning him after treating his injured leg. Eleanor's gaze softened with something like relief. I believe you, child. That horse returned with a nearly healed wound that someone had treated with skill. She set down her basket and moved closer, her voice dropping even lower. But you shouldn't be here. My husband is determined to see you punished. Why, Clara pressed. What have I done to earn his hatred? It's more than just my Cherokee blood, isn't it? A shadow passed over Eleanor's features. Harrison's reasons are his own. But yes, there is more to it than meets the eye. She glanced again toward the house. You must go. Now, I cannot help you. Please, Clara said desperately. My mother's journal, the sheriff took it when they arrested me. It's here somewhere. I need it back. Eleanor's face paled. You have your mother's journal. Oh, child. She wrung her hands, clearly torn. That book is dangerous. For both of us. Then you know what's in it. I know enough. Eleanor seemed to come to a decision. Meet me at the old trapper's cabin near Crow Creek tonight at midnight. Come alone. She gathered her basket and rose. Now go before someone sees you. Clara slipped away, her heart pounding with renewed hope. Eleanor knew something, perhaps everything. Tonight she might finally learn why her mother had died. As she made her way back through the forest, a twig snapped behind her. Clara froze, listening intently. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. She was being followed. Moving as silently as she could, Clara changed direction, heading deeper into the woods. She crossed a shallow stream, hoping to lose her pursuer in the water. But the footsteps continued, drawing steadily closer. Clara broke into a run, abandoning stealth for speed. Branches whipped at her face as she plunged through the underbrush. The footsteps behind her quickened to match her pace. A fallen log loomed in her path. Clara leaped over it, but her skirt caught on a jagged branch, yanking her backward. She tumbled to the ground, the breath knocked from her lungs. Before she could rise, a shadow fell across her. Clara looked up, expecting to see one of Wells's men, perhaps even the sheriff himself. Instead, she found herself staring into the stern face of Mason Ridge. "I thought I told you to stay at the cabin," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Clara scrambled to her feet, brushing leaves and dirt from her skirt. "I couldn't just sit there waiting," she defended herself. "I needed to do something." "So you decided to risk everything by approaching the Wells mansion in broad daylight." Mason's eyes blazed with barely contained anger. "Do you have any idea what would have happened if you'd been caught?" "I wasn't caught," Clara shot back. "And I've arranged a meeting with Eleanor Wells tonight. She knows something about my mother's journal, something important." This gave Mason pause. "Eleanor agreed to meet you at the old trapper's cabin midnight." Clara lifted her chin defiantly. She seemed afraid but willing to help. Mason's expression remained stern, but some of the anger faded from his eyes. "It could be a trap." "I don't think so. She and my mother were friends." Clara hesitated, then added, "Daniel mentioned reading something in the journal before it was taken. A name, Blackfeather. Does that mean anything to you?" A flicker of recognition crossed Mason's face, quickly masked. "It might," he said carefully. "It's an old name in these parts." Before Clara could press for more information, Mason gestured toward the path. "We should return to the cabin. If Eleanor Wells is willing to talk, we'll hear her out tonight. But we go together, not alone." As they walked back in tense silence, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Mason knew more than he was saying. The name Blackfeather had clearly meant something to him. Yet another piece of the puzzle that seemed to surround her mother's death. The sun was beginning its westward descent, casting long shadows through the trees. In less than 12 hours, they would meet with Eleanor Wells, and perhaps finally begin to understand the dark currents that ran beneath the surface of Sundown Valley. Ezra Johnson's forge glowed orange in the gathering dusk, casting dramatic shadows across the blacksmith's ebony features. His powerful arms gleamed with sweat as he hammered a piece of red-hot iron, each strike sending a shower of sparks into the air. Mason Ridge stood in the doorway, watching silently. The rhythmic clanging of hammer on anvil brought back memories of battle of chains, of men forging weapons to kill other men. When Ezra finally set down his hammer and plunged the shaped metal into a barrel of water, sending up a cloud of hissing steam, Mason stepped forward. "You still have a heavy hand with that hammer, old friend." Ezra turned, a smile breaking across his weathered face. "And you still move like a ghost, Ridge." He wiped his hands on his leather apron. "Heard you caused quite a stir at the gallows yesterday." "Couldn't let them hang an innocent girl." Ezra nodded thoughtfully. "The Hammond girl. Got her mother's spirit, that one." He gestured toward a bench near the forge. "Sit. Tell me what brings you down from your mountain." Mason settled on the bench, feeling the warmth of the forge seep into his tired bones. "I need information, Ezra, about Jacob Miller's death, about what's really happening in this town." The blacksmith's expression grew guarded. Dangerous questions, those. He glanced toward the open door, then moved to close it. "Wells has eyes and ears everywhere these days." "All the more reason to find the truth," Mason insisted. "The girl didn't kill Miller. Someone wants her silenced, same as her mother." Ezra's dark eyes sharpened. "You think Sarah Hammond's death wasn't an accident?" Do you... A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional pop and hiss from the forge. Finally, Ezra sighed deeply. No, he admitted. That woman was too careful with fire, too respectful of its power. He settled onto a stool across from Mason. There were rumors after she died that she'd been asking questions about the old Wells place, about Thomas Wells' disappearance 20 years ago. Mason leaned forward, his interest piqued. What kind of questions? About his Cherokee wife, about their child. Ezra's voice dropped even lower. About how Thomas Wells went out riding one day and never came home. A muscle twitched in Mason's jaw, and Harrison Wells inherited everything. Convenient, wasn't it? Ezra reached for a jug of water, taking a long drink before continuing. But here's something interesting. Miller was asking similar questions recently. Said he'd found something in the old stable records that didn't make sense. What kind of something? Ezra shrugged. He never said exactly, but he was spooked. Came to me last week asking if I remembered Thomas Wells. Asked if the man had any distinctive marks or scars. Did he? A burn scar on his right forearm shaped like a crescent moon. Got it saving a child from a house fire when he was young. Ezra's eyes held Mason's. Why all these questions, Ridge? What's your stake in this? Mason was saved from answering by a commotion outside. Raised voices and the clatter of hooves announced a group of riders approaching the smithy. That'll be the sheriff's men, Ezra said quietly. They've been making rounds asking about the Hammond girl. Mason rose, looking for a back exit. Ezra pointed to a small window. Through there. Leads to the alley behind the livery. They won't see you if you're quick. Mason clasped the blacksmith's shoulder. Thank you, old friend. We'll talk more when it's safer. Ridge, Ezra called softly as Mason headed for the window. Whatever you're planning, be careful. Wells isn't just mean, he's desperate. And desperate men are the most dangerous kind. Mason nodded grimly, then slipped through the window just as a heavy knock sounded at the smithy door. Outside, the evening air had cooled. Stars were beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. Mason kept to the shadows as he made his way through town, his mind working through everything Ezra had told him. If Jacob Miller had discovered something in the stable records, something connecting to Thomas Wells' disappearance, it would explain why he had been killed. But why frame Clara Hammond for the murder? Unless Miller's discovery and Sarah Hammond's journal contained the same dangerous truth. A truth that Harrison Wells would kill to keep buried. As Mason reached the edge of town, a figure stepped out from behind a large oak tree. Mason's hand dropped to the knife at his belt. Easy, Mr. Ridge, came a familiar voice. It's just me. Reverend Abernathy emerged into a patch of moonlight, his aged face lined with concern. The elderly pastor leaned heavily on a walking stick, his stooped shoulders testament to his years. Reverend, Mason acknowledged, relaxing slightly. You're out late, as are you. The old man's eyes were shrewd despite his frail appearance. Looking for answers, I suspect. Mason said nothing, waiting for the Reverend to continue. I've watched this town change over the years, Abernathy said, his voice soft with regret. Watched good people turn a blind eye to injustice for the sake of prosperity. Harrison Wells brought money and influence to Sundown Valley, but at what cost to its soul? You don't approve of the mayor, Mason observed. I approve of truth and justice, Mr. Ridge. Increasingly rare commodities in these parts. The Reverend sighed heavily. I knew Thomas Wells, you know, a good man despite his family's complicated history. He believed in treating all men as brothers regardless of the color of their skin. Unlike his son, Mason commented. Something flickered in the Reverend's eyes, a hint of knowledge withheld. Harrison is a man at war with himself, has been since he was a boy. What do you mean? Abernathy seemed to consider his words carefully. Some men build their lives on foundations of sand, Mr. Ridge. When the storms come, everything they've constructed can be washed away in an instant. He tapped his walking stick thoughtfully against the ground. I fear Harrison has spent so long defending his foundation that he's forgotten what he was building in the first place. Mason studied the old man's face, sensing he knew more than he was saying. You helped spare Clara Hammond yesterday. Why? Because I've seen too many innocents suffer while I stood silent. The Reverend's voice strengthened with conviction. No more. Not while I still have breath in my body. Then help us now, Mason urged. Clara didn't kill Jacob Miller. She's being framed to hide something bigger, something connected to Thomas Wells's disappearance and Sarah Hammond's death. Abernathy's gnarled hand tightened on his walking stick. Be careful stirring up old ghosts, Mr. Ridge. Some secrets once revealed cannot be buried again. He glanced toward the distant Wells mansion, its windows glowing with lamplight against the darkening sky. But if you truly seek the truth, you might look to the old family cemetery behind the Wells estate. Sometimes the dead have more to say than the living. With those cryptic words, the Reverend shuffled away, his hunched figure soon swallowed by the gathering darkness. Mason stood thoughtful for a long moment, considering the old man's advice. The Wells family cemetery. What secrets might be buried there? But that investigation would have to wait. The hour grew late, and he needed to return to the cabin before setting out to meet Eleanor Wells at midnight. With one last glance toward the distant mansion, Mason turned and headed back into the forest, his steps swift and sure in the growing darkness. High on the ridge, Clara waited anxiously for Mason's return. She had spent the afternoon with Daniel trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, despite the extraordinary circumstances. They had gathered berries near the cabin, and Clara had shown her brother how to identify useful herbs growing in the forest, knowledge passed down from their mother. But as twilight deepened into night, Clara's anxiety grew. Had Mason been caught in town? Had Eleanor Wells betrayed their planned meeting to her husband? She paced the cabin floor, pausing occasionally to check on Daniel, who had fallen asleep on Mason's bed, exhausted from the day's adventures. When the cabin door finally opened, Clara nearly cried out with relief. Mason stepped inside, his expression grave. "You're back," she said unnecessarily, searching his face for news. "Did you think I wouldn't be?" There was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. "I wasn't sure," Clara admitted. "Did you learn anything in town?" Mason removed his hat, hanging it on a peg by the door. "Perhaps." Ezra Johnson confirmed that Miller had discovered something in the stable records shortly before his death, something that frightened him. What was it? He didn't say exactly, but it had to do with Thomas Wells' disappearance 20 years ago. Mason moved to the fireplace, stirring the embers back to life. The Reverend also suggested we look at the old Wells family cemetery, said it might hold answers. Clara absorbed this information, trying to connect it to what little she knew. "And Blackfeather, did you learn anything about that name?" Mason was silent for a long moment, his back to her, as he fed small pieces of kindling to the growing flames. "It's a Cherokee name," he said finally. "Not common in these parts. But you recognized it earlier, when I mentioned it." Mason turned to face her, the firelight casting deep shadows across his weathered features. "Yes." Clara waited for him to elaborate, but he offered nothing more. His reticence was beginning to frustrate her. "If you know something that could help clear my name, that could explain why my mother died, why won't you tell me?" "Because some truths are better revealed in their own time," Mason replied, his voice softening slightly. "And because I'm not certain of all the connections yet. I don't want to lead you down false paths." Clara wanted to press further, but something in his expression stopped her. There was pain there, old and deep, and something else she couldn't quite identify, perhaps fear. "It's nearly 10 o'clock, Mason said, changing the subject. "We should prepare for our meeting with Eleanor Wells." They spent the next hour in quiet preparation. Mason cleaned and checked his rifle while Clara gathered a few items she thought might be useful: her mother's small medicine pouch, a knife Daniel had found in the woods, a length of sturdy rope. As midnight approached, they prepared to leave. Clara bent to kiss Daniel's forehead, reassured by his peaceful breathing. "He'll be safe here," Mason said, guessing her thoughts. "No one knows to look for him on my property." Clara nodded, though leaving her brother alone still worried her. "We'll be back before dawn," she said, as much to reassure herself as anything. The night was clear and star-filled as they made their way through the forest toward Crow Creek. A half-moon provided just enough light to navigate without lanterns, which might attract unwanted attention. They moved in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara found herself wondering about Mason Ridge, this enigmatic man who had inserted himself into her life at its most desperate moment. He claimed to have known her father, yet there was something more to his interest in her family's fate, something he wasn't sharing. The trapper's cabin came into view just before midnight. It stood in a small clearing near the creek, its weathered logs silvered by moonlight. No light showed from within, and the surrounding forest was quiet, save for the gentle burbling of the creek and the occasional hoot of an owl. Mason gestured for Clara to wait at the edge of the clearing while he circled the cabin, checking for any sign of ambush. Finding none, he signaled for her to join him. "Seems clear," he whispered, "but stay alert. If anything feels wrong, run for the creek. The water will hide your trail." Clara nodded, her heart beginning to race with nervous anticipation. What would Eleanor Wells reveal tonight? Would it be enough to save her from the gallows? They approached the cabin cautiously. Mason raised his hand to knock, then paused, his head tilting slightly. "Someone's inside," he murmured. "I can hear movement." Taking a deep breath, he knocked twice, then once more signaled they had agreed upon with Eleanor. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly the cabin door creaked open. In the dim moonlight filtering through the doorway, Clara could make out a woman's figure, but not Eleanor Wells. This woman was younger, her posture tense with fear or anticipation. "Clara Hammond," the woman whispered. "Are you alone?" "Who are you?" Clara demanded, taking a step back. "Where is Mrs. Wells?" The woman opened the door wider, revealing her face. "My name is Rebecca Turner. Eleanor Wells sent me in her place. It wasn't safe for her to come." Mason moved slightly, positioning himself between Clara and the stranger. "How do we know we can trust you?" Rebecca Turner hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object. She held it out to Clara. "Eleanor said to give you this. She said you would recognize it." Clara took the object, her breath catching, as her fingers closed around the familiar shape. It was a small, wooden fox identical to the one her father had carved for Daniel, except this one had been painted with delicate Cherokee symbols. "My mother made this," Clara whispered. "She gave it to Mrs. Wells years ago." Rebecca nodded. "Please, come inside quickly. It's not safe to talk in the open." Mason and Clara exchanged a glance, then followed the woman into the cabin. The interior was dimly lit by a single lantern set on a rough wooden table. The air smelled of pine resin and wood smoke from a fire that had burned earlier, but was now reduced to embers. Rebecca closed and barred the door behind them. In the better light, Clara could see she was perhaps 30, with honey-colored hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes that held a wary intelligence. "You're taking a risk meeting us like this," Mason observed, studying the woman carefully. "We're all taking risks," Rebecca replied, "but Eleanor believed it was necessary, and after what I've learned, I agree." "What have you learned?" Clara asked eagerly. "And why couldn't Mrs. Wells come herself?" Rebecca gestured for them to sit at the table. "Harrison Wells returned home unexpectedly this evening. Eleanor couldn't leave without arousing suspicion." She took a deep breath as if steeling herself. "But she wanted you to know your brother is safe." Clara started. "Daniel, what do you mean he's at Mason's cabin?" A strange expression crossed Rebecca's face. "Not that brother, your other brother." The words hung in the air, incomprehensible. Clara shook her head in confusion. "I don't have another brother, only Daniel." "You do," Rebecca insisted, "and he's the reason your mother died, the reason you're in danger now." Mason had gone very still, his eyes fixed on Rebecca Turner with an intensity that seemed to pierce through her. "Tell us everything," he commanded quietly, "from the beginning." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the lantern, turning it up to cast more light. "It began 20 years ago," she said, her voice steadying as she spoke, "with a man named Thomas Wells and a Cherokee woman called Morning Star." As the lantern flame grew brighter, illuminating the small cabin, Rebecca Turner began to tell a story that would forever change Clara Hammond's understanding of herself, her family, and the dark heart of Sundown Valley. Clara felt as though the floor had tilted beneath her feet. The lantern light seemed to waver, casting strange dancing shadows across Rebecca Turner's solemn face. Another brother. It wasn't possible. Her mother would have told her something so important. "You're mistaken," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother only had 2 children, me and Daniel." Rebecca shook her head slowly. "Not your mother's son, your father's." Mason shifted in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. His face had gone completely still, like the surface of a pond in winter. "Go on," he said to Rebecca, his voice rough. Rebecca folded her hands on the table, gathering her thoughts. 20 years ago, Thomas Wells was the most powerful man in Sundown Valley. His family had founded the town generations before, built the sawmill, owned most of the surrounding land. She glanced at Clara. But Thomas Wells was different from his ancestors. He believed all men were created equal, regardless of the color of their skin. "A rare view in these parts," Mason commented. Rebecca nodded, especially then. When most Cherokee had been forced onto reservations, Thomas employed them at fair wages, treated them with respect. Her eyes took on a distant look. During a visit to a Cherokee settlement, he met a woman named Morning Star. She was a healer respected among her people for her wisdom and beauty. Clara leaned forward, drawn into the story despite her skepticism. And they fell in love deeply, but such a union was unthinkable in society's eyes. Thomas didn't care. He married her in a private ceremony with only a few witnesses. One was your mother, Sarah, who was Morningstar's cousin. Clara's breath caught. My mother never mentioned any of this. She was sworn to secrecy. Thomas brought Morningstar to live in a cabin on the edge of his property, away from prying eyes. For a time, they were happy. Rebecca's expression darkened. Then Morningstar became pregnant. The fire popped and hissed in the silence that followed. She gave birth to a son, Rebecca continued. Thomas was overjoyed but also worried. He knew his family would never accept a mixed-blood heir, so he kept the child's existence secret, visiting his wife and son whenever he could slip away. What happened to them? Clara asked, though something in her heart already feared the answer. Morningstar died when the boy was 5, a fever that swept through the Cherokee settlements that winter. Thomas was devastated. He brought his son to the main house, introduced him as an orphan he'd decided to adopt. Mason's knuckles whitened as his hands closed into fists. And the boy's name, he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. Harrison Blackfeather Wells. The name hung in the air like smoke. Clara struggled to process what she was hearing. Harrison Wells, the man who hated her family, who had tried to hang her, was half Cherokee. It seemed impossible. If what you're saying is true, Clara said slowly, then Mayor Wells is my mother's cousin's son. But that doesn't make him my brother. No, Rebecca agreed, but it explains why he hates your family so much. Your existence reminds him of what he's tried so hard to forget, his Cherokee blood. Mason stood abruptly, moving to the cabin's small window. He stared out into the darkness, his profile sharp against the moonlight filtering through the glass. You haven't told us everything, he said without turning. What about Thomas Wells's disappearance? And how does this connect to John Hammond? Rebecca's hands trembled slightly. Thomas Wells had another son, one born to his first wife who died in childbirth. This son grew up resenting his father's progressive views, his kindness toward the Cherokee. When Thomas brought Harrison home, the older boy's resentment turned to hatred. And this older son, Tom, Mason pressed, became increasingly bitter as Thomas showed affection for Harrison. The final straw came when Thomas altered his will, leaving equal shares of his estate to both sons. Rebecca swallowed hard. 1 week later, Thomas Wells went riding and never returned. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Are you saying his own son murdered him? It was ruled an accident, a fall from his horse in rough country. The body was never found. Rebecca's voice dropped lower. But there were rumors, whispers, nothing anyone could prove. And Harrison, Mason asked, what happened to him after his father disappeared? The older son took control of everything. He made it clear that Harrison's position was precarious. If he wanted to remain in the Wells home, inherit any portion of the estate, he would have to deny his Cherokee heritage completely. Clara could see where this was leading, so Harrison buried his past, became more Wells than Blackfeather. More than that, Rebecca said, he became the most vocal opponent of the Cherokee in the region. As if by persecuting others, he could somehow erase that part of himself. Mason turned back from the window, his face in shadow. Where does John Hammond fit into this story? Rebecca glanced at Clara. Your father knew Thomas Wells from before the war. They had been friends despite their different stations in life. When John returned from the war, he began asking questions about Thomas's disappearance. Questions that made certain people uncomfortable. Is that why my father died? Clara asked, her throat tight with emotion. Because he was investigating Thomas Wells's death. Rebecca shook her head. Your father died from war wounds that never properly healed. But before he died, he entrusted what he had learned to your mother. Sarah became the keeper of secrets. Dangerous secrets. Clara thought of her mother's journal with its cryptic reference to men wearing masks to hide their true faces. And that's why she was killed, because she knew the truth about Harrison Wells. Because she knew the truth about both Wells brothers, Rebecca corrected, and because she had proof of Harrison's heritage, proof that could destroy everything he had built. Mason had been unnaturally still throughout Rebecca's explanation. Now he spoke, his voice carrying a weight Clara hadn't heard before. You still haven't explained who this other brother is that Clara supposedly has. Rebecca's eyes shifted between them, uncertainty flickering across her features. I assumed you knew. She took a deep breath. After Thomas disappeared, his older son took the Wells name and fortune. He reinvented himself just as Harrison did, but in a different way. What are you saying? Clara whispered. The older son of Thomas Wells didn't die as town records claim. He simply became someone else, someone whose past couldn't be traced, someone with no connection to the Wells family scandal. Rebecca's gaze settled on Mason. Someone like you, Mr. Ridge. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara stared at Mason, unable to process what Rebecca had just implied. Mason's face remained unreadable, a carved mask revealing nothing. You're mistaken, he said finally, his voice dangerously soft. Am I? Rebecca challenged. Eleanor has kept Thomas Wells's journals all these years. She knows the truth about both his sons Harrison and Mason. Clara stood, nearly knocking over her chair. This is absurd, she protested. Mason knew my father in the war. He's been helping me. Why would he do that if he was your half-brother, Rebecca finished gently, because John Hammond knew his secret, because your mother kept that secret even after John died, because Mason Ridge, or whatever his real name might be, owes a debt to your family that can never be repaid. Mason had gone completely still, his eyes fixed on Rebecca with an intensity that might have frightened Clara if it had been directed at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. You've told your story, Mrs. Turner. Now I think it's time you left. Rebecca stood, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. Eleanor wanted you to have this, she said, placing a small key on the table. It opens the back door to the Wells mansion. Tomorrow night, Harrison will be attending a town council meeting. The house will be empty except for Eleanor. She'll show you where Sarah's journal is hidden. Clara stared at the key, then at Rebecca. Why are you helping us? Why is Mrs. Wells helping us? A sad smile touched Rebecca's lips. Because 20 years of lies is enough. Because Eleanor loved Thomas Wells and has lived with the knowledge of his murder all this time, unable to speak the truth. She moved toward the door, then paused. And because I know what it's like to be trapped in a cage of someone else's making. With those enigmatic words, she slipped out into the night, leaving Clara and Mason alone in the lantern light. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire had died down to embers, casting the cabin in a dim, ruddy glow. Outside, an owl called its melancholy cry, floating through the darkness. Is it true? Clara finally asked, her voice barely audible. Are you Thomas Wells's son? Are you my brother? Mason remained by the window, his back to her. The moonlight silvered his hair, making him look suddenly older, more vulnerable. Half-brother, he corrected quietly. If the story is true. When is it? Clara pressed, a strange mixture of emotions churning inside her, anger, confusion, disbelief, and underneath it all, a flicker of desperate hope. Family. More family than she had known existed. Mason turned to face her, and in the dim light, Clara could see the resemblance to John Hammond that she had missed before, the set of the jaw, the shape of the eyes. Not identical, but similar enough that they could have shared a father. John Hammond was not my biological father, Mason said carefully, but he was more of a father to me than Thomas Wells ever was. Clara sank back into her chair, struggling to make sense of this revelation. So your real name is Mason Wells, once. He moved back to the table, settling heavily into his chair. I haven't used that name in more than 20 years. And Harrison is your brother, your full brother. Mason's jaw tightened. Half-brother, same father, different mothers. Harrison's mother was Cherokee. Mine was not. Why didn't you tell me? Hurt and betrayal colored Clara's voice. All this time you knew who I was, who my family was. You let me believe you were just a friend of my father's. I was a friend of your father's, Mason insisted. Everything I told you about John Hammond was true. He saved my life at Gettysburg. He was the finest man I ever knew. But you didn't tell me the whole truth. Mason sighed suddenly, looking every one of his 58 years. The whole truth is rarely simple, Clara, and rarely kind. Try me, she challenged, folding her arms across her chest. For a long moment, Mason studied her as if weighing how much she could bear to hear. Then he began to speak, his voice low and measured. I was born Mason Wells, eldest son of Thomas Wells and his first wife Elizabeth. I grew up privileged, entitled, believing the Wells name made me better than others. A hint of self-loathing crept into his voice. When my father began employing Cherokee workers, treating them as equals, I was disgusted. I had been raised with certain beliefs about people of color, beliefs I never thought to question. Clara listened silently, trying to reconcile this confession with the man she had come to know. When my father brought Harrison home, this half-breed child he claimed to have adopted, I knew immediately what he was, who he was. Mason's eyes took on a faraway look. I was 22, filled with anger and prejudice. I couldn't accept that my father would acknowledge this Indian boy as his son, give him the Wells name, promise him a share of the inheritance. So what did you do? Clara asked, though she feared the answer. Mason's gaze returned to her, direct and unflinching. I made Harrison's life miserable. Every day I reminded him that he didn't belong, that he was less than nothing. I turned the household staff against him, taught them to mock his heritage. When shame colored his voice. I was cruel in ways that still haunt me. And your father, what did he do? He tried to protect Harrison, to teach me compassion. But I wouldn't listen. Mason's hand clenched into a fist on the table. Then came the day he called me into his study, told me he had changed his will, that Harrison would receive an equal share of everything, that it was time I learned to see all men as brothers. A heavy silence fell. Clara could guess what came next, but she needed to hear him say it. And then, Mason met her gaze steadily. I didn't kill him, if that's what you're asking. Despite everything I've just told you, despite the bitter, hateful young man I was, I did not murder my father. Relief washed through Clara, stronger than she expected. She had come to respect Mason, to trust him. The thought that he might be a murderer had shaken her more than she cared to admit. But you know who did, she guessed. Mason nodded slowly. I believe so, though I have no proof, only suspicion and circumstance. Harrison. No. Mason's response was immediate and certain. Harrison loved our father. Despite my cruelty, despite everything, he worshipped Thomas Wells. Clara frowned, confused. Then who? Jeremiah Turner, Rebecca's father-in-law. Mason's expression darkened. He was my father's business partner and secretly his most bitter rival. Jeremiah coveted the Wells fortune, the Wells influence. And he had learned about Harrison's mother, knowledge he could use to destroy my father's reputation. So he killed him just like that. Murder is rarely just like that, Clara. Mason's voice was weary. There was an argument the night before my father disappeared. I overheard part of it. Jeremiah threatening to expose Harrison's parentage unless my father signed over controlling interest in the sawmill. What did your father say? He laughed. A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. Told Jeremiah he didn't care who knew the truth, that he was proud of both his sons and would acknowledge Harrison publicly if that's what it took. The smile faded. The next morning, my father went riding alone. He never returned. Clara absorbed this information, trying to fit it into the larger picture. But if Jeremiah Turner killed your father, why didn't you expose him? Why run away and change your identity? Mason's eyes held a haunted look. Because I was complicit in my way. Not in his death, I truly didn't know what Jeremiah planned, but in creating the circumstances that led to it. He took a deep breath. After my father disappeared, Jeremiah came to me with a proposition. He would help me gain control of the entire Wells estate, cutting Harrison out completely, if I would marry his daughter and merge our family's interests. Did you agree? God help me, I did. Self-loathing filled Mason's voice. I was young, ambitious, still filled with hatred for my half-brother. It seemed like the perfect solution. What changed? I began to have suspicions about my father's disappearance, little things that didn't add up. And then, Mason paused, seeming to struggle with the memory. Then I found blood on Jeremiah's saddle, blood and a few strands of hair that matched my father's horse. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. You confronted him. I tried to. He denied everything, of course, said I was imagining things, going mad with grief. Mason's jaw tightened. That night there was a fire in my room. I nearly didn't make it out alive. Jeremiah tried to kill you, Clara whispered. Mason nodded grimly. I knew then that I wouldn't live to see my wedding day if I stayed. So I fled, enlisted in the army under a new name, became Mason Ridge, a man with no past, no family, nothing to lose. And Harrison, what happened to him? Jeremiah took him under his wing out of guilt, perhaps, or to keep an eye on him. Taught him to hate his Cherokee heritage, to bury it so deeply that no one would ever suspect. Mason's voice grew bitter. He molded Harrison into his own image, ruthless, ambitious, willing to do anything to maintain power and position. Clara tried to imagine the frightened, grieving boy Harrison must have been, and the hard, cruel man he had become. Did you ever try to contact him? Tell him the truth. Once after the war, I came back to Sundown Valley thinking enough time had passed, thinking perhaps we could reconcile, find justice for our father. Mason's expression clouded. But the Harrison I found was unrecognizable. He had married Eleanor, a match arranged by Jeremiah, and taken complete control of the Wells holdings after Jeremiah's death. He had become a bitter, hateful man who despised anything Cherokee. So you left again? Not immediately. I tried to gather evidence about our father's murder. That's when I met your father, John Hammond. For the first time, a genuine warmth entered Mason's voice. John had known my father, respected him. He was asking his own questions about Thomas's disappearance. And you became friends, Clara surmised. More than friends. Brothers in arms first in our private investigation, then in the war when we both enlisted. Mason's eyes held Clara's. John knew everything, who I was, what I was running from. He accepted me anyway, flaws and all. When he was wounded at Gettysburg, I carried him to safety, just as I told you. But what I didn't tell you was that he extracted a promise from me that day. What kind of promise? That if he didn't survive his wounds, I would look after his family, his Cherokee wife and his daughter. Mason's voice softened. He made me swear it on my honor as a Wells, the only oath he knew I wouldn't break. Clara felt tears prickling behind her eyes. This was so much to take in this tangled web of family connections, secrets, and betrayals. But you didn't come, she said, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. After my father died, you didn't come. After my mother died, you still didn't come. Where were you when we needed you? Pain flashed across Mason's weathered features. I wanted to come. God knows I did. But your mother, he hesitated. Sarah didn't trust me. She knew who I was, what I had been. She made it clear that she would raise her children without help from a Wells, no matter what John had wanted. So you just gave up, left us alone? No. Mason's denial was fierce. I watched over you from a distance, made sure you had what you needed even if you didn't know where it came from. The extra game that mysteriously appeared on your doorstep in winter, the repairs to your roof after the big storm, the money that the Reverend gave you claiming it was from a church fund. Clara stared at him, memories clicking into place. All those small kindnesses she had attributed to luck or neighborly charity. That was all you... Mason nodded, a hint of embarrassment coloring his features. It wasn't enough, I know that, but it was all Sarah would allow. His expression darkened. When she died, when I heard about the fire, I knew it wasn't an accident. I knew Harrison, or someone working for him, had silenced her because she knew too much. But I had no proof, and you and Daniel had already been forced to move to the old Hammond cabin. So you kept watching from afar, Clara said, understanding dawning, until I found you in the forest sick with fever. Yes, by then I had settled in this ridge, built this cabin. I was trying to gather evidence against Harrison, find proof of what he'd done to Sarah. Mason's eyes held hers. When you saved me that day, treated my fever with your mother's remedies, I knew I couldn't stay hidden any longer. You were clearly your mother's daughter, and that put you in danger. It was only a matter of time before Harrison moved against you too. Clara absorbed all of this emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to rage at Mason for keeping so many secrets, for letting her family struggle alone. Another part understood his impossible position, trapped between promises and rejection, between past sins and present atonement. Why did Harrison frame me for Miller's murder? She asked finally. Why now, Sal? Because of your mother's journal, Mason replied. Harrison must have learned you'd found it, realized what it contained. Miller's death gave him the perfect opportunity to silence you permanently. Clara thought of the journal with its cryptic references to the truth about Sundown Valley. What exactly did my mother know? Everything. The truth about Harrison's Cherokee mother, the truth about Thomas Wells's murder, the truth about who I really was. Mason's voice dropped lower. And she had proof letters, documents, perhaps even a confession. Something concrete enough to destroy Harrison completely. And that proof is in her journal, Clara concluded. I believe so. Clara's mind raced, piecing together this complex puzzle. So tomorrow night we use Eleanor's key to enter the Wells mansion and recover the journal. Then what? Harrison is still the most powerful man in Sundown Valley. Who would believe us over him? The journal alone might not be enough, Mason acknowledged. We need more physical evidence of Thomas Wells's murder, if it still exists, and, he hesitated, we need to find Harrison's birth certificate or some other proof of his parentage. Without that, it's just our word against his. Clara considered this. Rebecca mentioned a family cemetery behind the Wells estate. Reverend Abernathy suggested you look there too. Could there be evidence buried with Thomas Wells? A gleam of interest lit Mason's eyes. Thomas isn't buried there, his body was never found. But Morningstar might be. Harrison wouldn't have wanted his Cherokee mother buried in the town cemetery where everyone could see. So we check the family file first, then use Eleanor's key to enter the house and find the journal, Clara summarized. All before my 3 days are up and you have to hang in my place. Mason nodded grimly. That's the plan, though I'd prefer to avoid the hanging part if possible. Despite everything, Clara found herself smiling slightly. Agreed. A comfortable silence fell between them. The revelation of their family connection still felt surreal to Clara, but there was also a strange rightness to it. Mason Ridge, or Wells, had been a shadow presence in her life for years, watching over her family from afar. Learning he was her half-brother explained much, even as it raised new questions. We should head back, Mason said, rising from his chair. Daniel will be worried if he wakes and finds us both gone. Clara stood as well, suddenly remembering her brother with a pang of guilt. In the shock of Rebecca's revelations, she had momentarily forgotten about Daniel. Yes, let's go home. The word home slipped out naturally and neither commented on it. But as they doused the lantern and stepped out into the moonlit night, Clara felt a small shift in her relationship with Mason, a tentative acceptance of this unexpected bond between them. The forest was quiet as they made their way back to the ridge, each lost in private thoughts. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges. But tonight at least some truths had been spoken that had remained buried for far too long. The old Well family cemetery lay in a secluded grove behind the mansion, surrounded by ancient oak trees whose spreading branches created a natural cathedral. Marble headstones, some dating back to the town's founding, stood in neat rows within a wrought iron fence gone rusty with age. Clara and Mason approached cautiously in the pre-dawn light, having left Daniel sleeping safely in the cabin. The town was still quiet, most residents not yet risen to begin their day's work. Even the Wells mansion showed no signs of activity, its windows dark against the pale eastern sky. The groundskeeper won't arrive for another hour, Mason whispered as they slipped through the cemetery gate. We should be alone until then. Clara nodded, her eyes scanning the rows of headstones. Most bore the Wells name, with dates reaching back to the early 1800s. Ornate angels in weeping willows had been carved into the older stones, while newer markers were simpler, more austere. What exactly are we looking for? She asked softly. Anything unusual? A grave that seems out of place? Or perhaps... Mason trailed off his attention, caught by something at the far end of the cemetery, where the neat rows gave way to wilder growth. He moved toward it, Clara following close behind. Beyond the last row of Wells family plots, partially hidden by tall grass and morning glory vines, stood a single simple stone. No name marked its surface, only a carved symbol, a crescent moon cradling a small star. Cherokee, Clara whispered, recognizing the symbol from her mother's teachings. Morning Star's grave. Mason knelt beside the stone, his fingers tracing the carving reverently. Yes, Thomas must have buried her here, as close to the family plot as he dared. But he couldn't put her name, not without causing a scandal. Clara felt a deep sadness for this woman she had never known buried. Without her name, her identity erased even in death. Harrison's mother, she murmured. My mother's cousin. Wishton began carefully clearing away the vines and overgrowth from around the stone. Harrison probably hasn't visited this grave in years. He spent too long denying his Cherokee blood. As more of the stone was revealed, Clara noticed something unusual about its base. Look, she said, pointing. There's an opening underneath like a small compartment. Mason examined the area she indicated. Sure enough, at the base of the headstone was a small recess, almost like a drawer built into the stone itself. It was closed tight. It seemed nearly invisible, unless one knew to look for it. Clever Thomas, Mason murmured. He pressed against different parts of the stone until a soft click sounded. The small compartment is slid open, revealing a metal box nestled inside. With careful hands, Mason removed the box. It was made of tin about the size of a man's palm, its surface dulled with age and exposure. A simple clasp held it closed. "Open it," Clara urged, her heart racing with anticipation. Mason hesitated only briefly before lifting the clasp. Inside, protected from the elements by the metal container, lay a folded document and a small object wrapped in faded red cloth. Mason unfolded the document first. It was a birth certificate, the ink faded but still legible. "Harrison Blackfeather Wells," he read aloud, "son of Thomas James Wells in Morningstar Blackfeather, born April 17th, 1843. Clara peered over his shoulder at the document. Proof of Harrison's parentage. Exactly what we need. Mason carefully refolded the certificate and handed it to Clara. Then he unwrapped the small object from its cloth covering. A wedding ring gleamed in the growing light, a simple gold band with tiny stars engraved around its circumference. Inside, barely visible, were the initials TW and MSB. "Thomas gave this to Morningstar," Mason said softly. "I remember him wearing a matching one, though he kept it on a chain beneath his shirt." His voice caught slightly. He loved her very much. Clara touched the ring gently. He wanted to preserve the evidence of their marriage, protect Harrison's claim as his legitimate son. She looked up at Mason. "Your father was a good man, wasn't he?" A complex mixture of emotions crossed Mason's face. Grief, regret, pride. "Better than I knew, better than I deserved as a son." He carefully returned the ring to its cloth wrapping. "Let's take these and go. We've found what we came for." As they rose to leave, Clara noticed a small mound of freshly turned earth a few feet from Morningstar's grave. It seemed out of place in the otherwise undisturbed cemetery. "Mason," she said, pointing, "someone's been digging here recently." Mason frowned, moving to examine the disturbed ground. Using a stick, he poked at the loose soil until it struck something solid. Kneeling, he began to dig with his hands. A few inches down, his fingers closed around something hard and rectangular. He pulled it free from the earth, a small leather-bound book, its cover stained with dirt, but otherwise intact. "Hunt. My mother's journal." Clara breathed, recognizing it immediately. "But how did it get here?" Mason opened the book carefully. Inside the front cover, in elegant handwriting, was an inscription. "For Clara, when the time is right, Eleanor." "Eleanor Wells," Mason said. "She must have taken it from Harrison's study and hidden it here knowing we'd come looking." Clara took the journal with trembling hands. After all this time, all the danger surrounding it, the book seemed almost ordinary, just leather and paper and ink. Yet within its pages lay the truth that could save her life and bring justice to her family. "We should go," Mason urged, glancing toward the mansion. "The groundskeeper will be here soon." They left the cemetery as quietly as they had come, the birth certificate and journal hidden safely inside Clara's dress. The morning sun had just cleared the eastern mountains, painting the valley in gold and amber light. Another day had begun in Sundown Valley, perhaps one of the last in which Harrison Wells would reign unchallenged. Back at the cabin, they found Daniel awake and cooking a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush over the fire. His face brightened when they entered. "Clara, Mr. Ridge, where did you go so early?" Clara hugged her brother, kissing the top of his head. "We had an errand to run, little fox. But we found something important." She produced the journal, showing it to him. "Mama's book. Mrs. Wells helped us find it." Daniel's eyes widened. "The one those men were looking for, the one with all the secrets." "The very same," Clara confirmed. "And now we're going to read it together and learn exactly what Mama wanted us to know." While Daniel finished preparing breakfast, Clara and Mason settled at the table with the journal. The pages were filled with Sarah Hammond's neat handwriting, detailing daily life herbal remedies and observations about Sundown Valley. But interspersed among these ordinary entries were passages of a different nature, coded messages that only someone familiar with Cherokee symbols would understand. Clara traced the markings with her finger. "Mama taught me these symbols when I was young. She said our ancestors used them to communicate secretly when white settlers were nearby. Can you read them? Mason asked. Clara nodded, bending closer to the page. This first section talks about Thomas Wells and Morning Star, their marriage, Harrison's birth. Much of what Rebecca told us last night. She turned several pages. Here she begins writing about Thomas's disappearance. Mason leaned forward, his expression intent. What does it say? Clara read slowly, translating the Cherokee symbols into English. Thomas Wells did not fall from his horse as claimed. He was struck from behind while riding near Raven's Peak. His body was taken to the old silver mine and hidden deep within. Mason's face hardened. Raven's Peak is on the northern edge of what was Turner property, and the silver mine was abandoned decades ago after a partial collapse. There's more, Clara continued. The murder weapon, a miner's pickaxe, belongs to Jeremiah Turner. I have seen it hidden in his study, still stained with blood, despite attempts to clean it. She looked up at Mason. Jeremiah Turner killed your father just as you suspected. And my father's body has been in that mine all these years, Mason said, his voice hollow. We need to find him, bring him home properly. Clara turned more pages, reading entries that detailed Sarah's quiet investigation over the years. Mama was thorough. She collected statements from people who saw Jeremiah riding near Raven's Peak the day Thomas disappeared. She even made a map of the mine marking where she believed the body was hidden. Your mother was a remarkable woman, Mason said softly, brave beyond measure. Clara continued reading, but suddenly went very still. Mason, she said, her voice tight. Listen to this. Harrison Wells is not what he appears. The man who calls himself Harrison Wells is not Thomas's son. Mason frowned. What? That can't be right. I grew up with Harrison. I knew him as a boy. Clara read on, her voice growing more urgent. The real Harrison Blackfeather Wells died of fever at age 12 shortly after Thomas's disappearance. Jeremiah Turner, fearing the loss of control over the Wells estate, substituted his own son in Harrison's place. The boy was of similar age and appearance, and few in town had seen Harrison up close. With Thomas gone and Mason fled, no one could dispute the deception. But that's impossible, Mason protested, though doubt had crept into his voice. I would have known if my brother had been replaced by an imposter. You were gone by then, Clara reminded him, and the entry says it happened after your father disappeared when the real Harrison was 12. She looked back at the journal. Mama writes that she learned the truth years later when she treated the false Harrison for a hunting wound. He had no scar on his shoulder where the real Harrison had been burned as a child. Mason sat back, stunned by this revelation. So the man who calls himself Harrison Wells, the man who tried to hang you, is actually Jeremiah Turner's son. According to Mama, yes, his real name was Ephraim Turner. Clara continued reading. Ephraim Turner was molded by his father to take Harrison's place to secure the Turner family's control over the Wells fortune. He was taught to hate his supposed Cherokee heritage, to deny it publicly, while using it as an excuse for his darker complexion and black hair. Daniel, who had been listening wide-eyed while serving breakfast, piped up. So the mayor isn't really Cherokee at all. He's been pretending. It seems so little fox, Clara said, still trying to process this herself. Mason's expression had darkened with each new revelation. Jeremiah Turner murdered my father, let my brother die, then inserted his own son into the Wells family to steal our fortune. His hands clenched into fists on the table. And I ran away, making it all possible. Clara reached across the table, covering his hand with her own. You couldn't have known, Mason. You were young, frightened, and grieving. I abandoned my brother when he needed me most, Mason said bitterly. If I had stayed, then Jeremiah might have killed you too, Clara interrupted firmly. You can't change the past, but we can bring the truth to light now. Mason took a deep breath, visibly pulling himself together. You're right. What else does the journal say? Clara turned to the final pages. Mama writes that she confronted Eleanor with what she had learned. Eleanor admitted knowing the truth, but was too afraid of her husband to speak out. Clara frowned, reading ahead. The last entry was written the night before the fire. Mama says she had gathered all the evidence, the birth certificate statements from witnesses, even the pickaxe used to kill Thomas, and was planning to take it to the territorial marshal. But she never got the chance, Mason finished grimly. Harrison, or Ephraim rather, must have learned of her plans and silenced her before she could expose him. Clara closed the journal, a cold determination settling over her. Then we'll finish what she started. We have the birth certificate proving the real Harrison's parentage. We have Mama's journal detailing everything. Now we need to find Thomas's body and the murder weapon. The old silver mine could be dangerous after all these years, Mason cautioned. And if the pickaxe was in Jeremiah's study, it would now be in Harrison's possession at the Wells mansion. Then we split up, Clara decided. You know the mine, you can find Thomas's remains. I'll use Eleanor's key to enter the mansion tonight during the town council meeting and search for the pickaxe. Mason shook his head firmly. Too dangerous. Harrison might return early, or there could be servants still in the house. Eleanor will help me, Clara insisted, and we don't have time to argue. The 3 days are almost up. By tomorrow evening, I'm supposed to hang, or you in my place. Her eyes held his. This is our only chance, Mason. After a long moment, Mason nodded reluctantly. Very well, but Daniel stays with me. I won't have him anywhere near the Wells mansion. Agreed, Clara said, relieved. She turned to her brother. You'll help Mr. Ridge today, little fox. It's an important job. Daniel nodded solemnly, though disappointment flickered in his eyes. I wish I could go with you, Clara. I know, but I need you safe. She hugged him tightly. And I need you to keep Mr. Ridge safe, too. Can you do that for me? Daniel straightened on his small shoulders. I will, I promise. As they finished their breakfast and began preparing for the day's dangerous tasks, Clara felt a curious mixture of fear and determination. So much had changed in the past few days, her understanding of her family, her connection to Mason, her knowledge of the dark secrets that had shaped Sundown Valley for generations. Tonight, those secrets would finally be exposed to the light. One way or another, justice would be served. She only hoped they would all live to see it. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the last wisps of mist from the valley floor. In town, the gallows still stood in the square, a grim reminder of what awaited if they failed. But Clara refused to let fear overtake her. Her mother had died seeking the truth. She would honor that sacrifice by finishing what Sarah Hammond had begun. With renewed resolve, Clara turned to Mason and Daniel. Let's get ready. We have a long day ahead. The old Wells clock on Mason's mantle ticked steadily, marking the passage of time as they prepared to challenge the man who had ruled Sundown Valley through deception and murder for 20 long years. Dusk settled over Sundown Valley, like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the chirping of crickets and the first winking stars. Clara stood at the edge of the forest behind the Wells mansion, her heart hammering against her ribs. In her pocket, Eleanor's key felt impossibly heavy, a small piece of metal that could either save her life or end it. From this vantage point, she could see light blazing from every window of the town hall across the square, where the council meeting would keep Harrison, or Ephraim, as she now knew him to be, occupied for at least 2 hours. The mansion itself was mostly dark, save for a single lamp burning in what Clara knew to be Eleanor's sitting room. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. The plan was simple enough: use Eleanor's key to enter through the garden door. Find the murder weapon with Eleanor's help, then slip away unseen. Simple yet fraught with danger. If Harrison returned early, if a servant raised the alarm, if the weapon was not where Eleanor believed it to be. Clara pushed these thoughts aside. She could not afford doubt, not now. Gathering her courage, she moved silently across the manicured lawn, keeping to the shadows cast by towering elm trees. The garden door was small and unobtrusive, hidden behind a trellis of climbing roses. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she fitted the key into the lock. The mechanism turned smoothly without a sound. The door swung inward, revealing a dimly lit hallway. Clara slipped inside, closing the door carefully behind her. The air smelled of beeswax and lemon oil, with undertones of tobacco and expensive cologne, the scent of wealth and privilege. She followed the hall toward the warm glow emanating from Eleanor's sitting room. The door stood ajar, and through the gap, Clara could see the elegant figure of Eleanor Wells seated in a high-backed chair, her silver-streaked dark hair gleaming in the lamplight. She appeared to be alone, her hands busy with a piece of embroidery. Clara tapped softly on the doorframe. Eleanor looked up, setting aside her needlework, as she rose with fluid grace. "Clara," she said quietly, her blue eyes warming with relief. "Thank heavens you have come. We haven't much time." Clara stepped into the room, suddenly uncertain in the presence of this refined woman who had been her mother's friend and confidant. "Mrs. Wells," she began. "I want to thank you, Eleanor, please," the older woman interrupted gently. "After all we've been through, I think we can dispense with formalities." She moved to close the sitting room door, then turned back to Clara. Rebecca delivered my message then, about the journal. Clara nodded. Yes. We found it in the cemetery, along with Harrison's birth certificate, the real Harrison's. A shadow crossed Eleanor's face. So you know the truth. About Ephraim, about what happened to Thomas and his son. We know some of it, Clara acknowledged. My mother's journal explained much, but there are still pieces missing. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been troubling her since reading Sarah's final entries. Why did you stay silent all these years? You knew your husband was an imposter, that he had taken Harrison's place. You knew his father had murdered Thomas Wells. Eleanor's elegant features seemed to age before Clara's eyes, deep lines of sorrow etching themselves around her mouth and eyes. She sank back into her chair, gesturing for Clara to take the seat opposite. Fear, she said simply. At first it was fear for my life. Jeremiah Turner made it quite clear what would happen if I revealed what I knew about his son's ascension. Her lips curved in a bitter smile. Later it became more complicated. I had married Ephraim believing him to be Harrison Wells. By the time I discovered the truth, we had been husband and wife for 3 years. You could have left, Clara said, though she understood it wasn't that simple, especially for a woman. And gone where, done what? Eleanor's voice held no self-pity, only a weary pragmatism. I had no family, no fortune of my own, and there was Thomas to consider. Clara frowned. Thomas? But he was already dead. Not that Thomas. Eleanor's gaze dropped to her hands, which had twisted together in her lap. My son, Thomas Jeremiah Wells, named for his supposed grandfather and his actual grandfather. He's away at school back east, now has been for years. Ephraim insisted, wanted him raised as a proper Wells, far from what he called the backward influences of Sundown Valley. You have a son, Clara whispered, this new piece of information shifting her understanding yet again. Does he know about his father's true identity? Eleanor shook her head. No, he believes himself to be a Wells through and through. Ephraim has made certain of that. A hint of steel entered her voice. But he is my son as well, and there is goodness in him that his father cannot erase no matter how hard he tries. Clara absorbed this understanding better now, the impossible position Eleanor had found herself in. My mother, she was your friend. She knew everything, didn't she? Sarah was the only person I could trust, the only one who knew the whole truth and didn't judge me for my silence. Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears. When she died, when Ephraim had her killed, something in me broke. I couldn't speak out, not yet, not while my son might suffer for it, but I could no longer live with the lies either. So you began gathering evidence, Clara guessed. Preserving what my mother had collected, adding to it over time. Eleanor nodded. Yes, I knew the day would come when the truth would need to be told. When you were arrested for Miller's murder, I realized that day had arrived. She rose from her chair, moving to a delicate escritoire in the corner of the room. And now we must act quickly. Ephraim will not remain at the council meeting forever. From a hidden compartment in the desk, Eleanor withdrew a small cloth-wrapped bundle. She placed it on the table between them, her hands lingering on it momentarily before drawing back. The murder weapon, Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Yes, Jeremiah Turner's pickaxe, the one he used to kill Thomas Wells 20 years ago. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. Ephraim keeps it as a reminder, I think. A trophy of sorts, though he would never admit as much. Clara carefully unwrapped the cloth. The pickaxe was smaller than she had imagined, more of a prospector's tool than a miner's implement. Its wooden handle was dark with age, and though the metal head showed signs of having been cleaned, dark stains still clung to the crevices where wood met iron. Blood, Eleanor confirmed, seeing Clara's gaze. Thomas Wells's blood preserved by Jeremiah's hasty cleaning and Ephraim's perverse sentimentality. Clara rewrapped the pickaxe, her stomach turning slightly at the thought of handling the weapon that had ended Thomas Wells's life. This is the evidence we need. With this, my mother's journal, and Harrison's birth certificate, we can prove everything. There's more, Eleanor said, returning to the escritoire. She withdrew a leather portfolio and handed it to Clara. Letters from Thomas to Morning Star. Correspondence between Jeremiah and Ephraim, discussing their plan after the real Harrison fell ill. Financial records showing how the Wells fortune was systematically plundered over the years. Her blue eyes met Clara's. Enough evidence to hang Ephraim Turner 10 times over. Clara felt a surge of hope as she accepted the portfolio. With this, we can go directly to the territorial marshal. We won't need to convince the town the law will handle everything. The marshal won't arrive until tomorrow, Eleanor cautioned, and Ephraim still holds considerable influence. You must be careful, Clara. He's more dangerous now than ever with everything at stake. A clock somewhere in the house chimed 9 times. Eleanor tensed. The council meeting will be ending soon. You must go quickly. She hesitated, then clasped Clara's hand in both of hers. I never had a daughter, but if I had, I would have wanted her to have your courage. Your mother would be proud. Throat tight with emotion, Clara squeezed Eleanor's hands. Come with me, she urged impulsively. You don't have to stay here waiting for him to return. A sad smile touched Eleanor's lips. My place is here for now. There are things I must do before I can leave this house for good. She released Clara's hands. Go. Use the same door you came in. I'll make sure your path is clear. With the pickaxe wrapped and hidden inside her shawl and the portfolio tucked securely beneath her arm, Clara made her way back through the darkened hallway. She paused at the garden door, listening intently for any sound that might indicate danger. Hearing nothing, she slipped outside into the cool night air. The journey back through the town was fraught with tension. Clara kept to the shadows, avoiding the few townspeople still about at this hour. As she passed the town hall, she saw men beginning to emerge. The council meeting apparently concluded. She ducked into an alleyway, pressing herself against a wall as several figures passed by on the main street. Preposterous demands, came a familiar voice, Harrison Wells, or rather Ephraim Turner. As if I would consider allowing a school for Cherokee children within town limits. Quite right, agreed another voice, Samuel Driscoll, the banker. Bad enough we have to tolerate them passing through on trading days. Their voices faded as they moved away, but Clara remained frozen in place, cold anger washing through her at their casual bigotry. The irony was almost unbearable. Ephraim Turner pretending to be half Cherokee while spewing hatred toward the very people whose identity he had appropriated. When she was certain they had gone, Clara continued her journey, taking a circuitous route that eventually led her back to the forest path. Only when the lights of town had faded behind her did she allow herself to breathe normally again. She had done it. She had the evidence they needed. Now it was up to Mason to find Thomas Wells' remains in the old silver mine. The abandoned silver mine loomed at the base of Raven's Peak, its timber-framed entrance sagging with age and neglect. Vines had claimed much of the structure, nature slowly reclaiming what man had briefly stolen. A weathered sign, barely legible after decades of exposure, warned, "Danger, unstable ground, keep out." Mason stood before the entrance, a lantern in one hand and a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. Beside him, Daniel peered into the darkness with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. The boy had been quiet during their journey to the mine, absorbing everything Mason had told him about Thomas Wells, about the real Harrison, about the elaborate deception that had shaped Sundown Valley for 2 decades. Is great-grandfather really in there? Daniel asked, his young voice solemn in the gathering twilight. Mason glanced down at the putties, still adjusting to the idea that John Hammond's children were in a way his niece and nephew. If your mother's journal is correct, yes, and today we're going to bring him home. Daniel nodded, his small face serious. So he can be buried properly. With his name on a stone like Grandmother Morningstar. Exactly. Mason was continually surprised by the boy's perception, his ability to grasp complex situations despite his tender age. But it could be dangerous inside. The mine has been abandoned for many years. You must stay close to me and do exactly as I say. Understood. Yes, sir, Daniel promised, standing a little straighter. He held his own small lantern carefully as if it were a precious treasure. Mason took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The silver mine had been a source of the Wells family's initial fortune, worked until the main vein played out in the 1830s. As a boy, he had been forbidden to enter. It warned of cave-ins and bad air. Now, decades later, he was about to descend into its depths to recover the remains of his murdered father. Stay behind me, he instructed Daniel as they ducked through the sagging timbers. And watch where you step. The mine entrance gave way to a narrow tunnel that sloped gently downward. The air was cool and damp, with a mineral tang that caught in the back of the throat. Their lanterns cast jumping shadows on rough-hewn walls, still bearing the marks of pickaxes and drills from a bygone era. According to Sarah Hammond's journal, Thomas Wells' body had been hidden in a side chamber off the main shaft about a quarter-mile in. Mason moved cautiously, testing each step before committing his weight alert for any sign of structural weakness in the ceiling or walls. Daniel followed silently, his eyes wide as he took in their surroundings. Occasionally, his small hand would slip into Mason's, seeking reassurance in the oppressive darkness. They had progressed perhaps 200 yards when Mason noticed the first signs of disturbance: boot prints in the dusty floor, fresher than they should have been in an abandoned mine. "Someone's been here recently," he murmured, crouching to examine the prints more closely. They appeared to be from a single individual moving purposefully deeper into the mine. "Is it Clara?" Daniel asked hopefully. Mason shook his head. "These are a man's prints, large, heavy." A cold suspicion formed in his mind. "Come, we need to hurry." They quickened their pace, following the mysterious tracks deeper into the mine. The main shaft branched occasionally, but the footprints always continued along the primary tunnel. After about 15 minutes of careful progress, they reached a junction where the main shaft continued straight, while a smaller tunnel branched off to the right. The boot prints led down the side tunnel. Mason hesitated, consulting the crude map Sarah had drawn in her journal. According to her information, Thomas's body should be hidden in a chamber off this very side tunnel. The fact that someone else was headed there could not be coincidence. "Daniel," he said quietly, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes, "I want you to wait here. I need to see who's ahead of us." Fear flickered across Daniel's face. Alone in the dark, Mason placed his lantern on a rock ledge, adjusting it so it cast light in both directions at the junction. "You'll have light, and I won't be going long. But it could be dangerous ahead, and I promised Clara I'd keep you safe." Daniel bit his lip, clearly torn between fear of being left alone and desire to be brave. Finally, he nodded. "I'll wait, but please hurry, Mr. Ridge." "I will." Mason squeezed the boy's shoulder reassuringly. "If you hear anything strange, anything at all, call out for me. I won't be far." Leaving his own lantern with Daniel, Mason took the boy's smaller light and moved quietly down the side tunnel. Here the passage narrowed, forcing him to duck his head in places where the ceiling dipped low. The air grew more stale, the silence more complete, broken only by the occasional drip of water from unseen crevices. He extinguished his lantern as he caught sight of a faint glow ahead, another light source moving slightly as its bearer worked. Creeping forward in the darkness, Mason approached what appeared to be a small chamber carved into the rock. From within came the sound of digging, punctuated by labored breathing and occasional muttered curses. Mason peered cautiously around the edge of the entrance. The chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, its walls glittering faintly with traces of silver ore deemed too meager to extract. A lantern sat on a rock shelf, illuminating a man's broad back as he dug frantically at the far wall with a shovel. Even without seeing his face, Mason recognized him immediately. Harrison Wells, Ephraim Turner, still dressed in his fine clothes from the council meeting, now soiled with dirt and sweat. For a moment, Mason was too stunned to move. What was Ephraim doing here? How had he known where to find Thomas's body? Unless the realization hit like a physical blow. Eleanor must have revealed their plans, whether willingly or under duress. And now Ephraim was attempting to remove the evidence before they could find it. Mason's hand dropped to the knife at his belt, but before he could decide on a course of action, his foot dislodged a small stone. The pebble skittered across the chamber floor. Ephraim whirled around, shovel raised defensively. His eyes, so like his father Jeremiah's, widened in shock and then narrowed with recognition. "You," he spat, his voice echoing in the confined space. "I might have known." Mason stepped fully into the chamber, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Hello, Ephraim. Or do you prefer Harrison these days?" Ephraim's handsome features contorted with rage. "How dare you use that name, you who abandoned your birthright, who ran like a coward when—" He broke off, staring more intently at Mason. "Wait, I know you. You're the mountain man who interfered with the Hammond girls' hanging." "I'm more than that," Mason said quietly. "I'm the man whose identity you and your father stole. I'm Mason Wells, eldest son of Thomas Wells." The shovel in Ephraim's hands wavered, then steadied. "Mason Wells is dead. Has been for years." "Clearly not." Mason took another step into the chamber. "Just as it's clear what you're doing here. Removing evidence of your father's crime before it can be found." Ephraim's laugh held no humor. "Evidence? There's nothing here but old bones and dust. Nothing that would convince anyone of anything. Perhaps not alone, Mason acknowledged, but combined with Sarah Hammond's journal, with your real birth certificate, with the letters between you and Jeremiah planning the substitution after the real Harrison died. He watched Ephraim's face pale with each item listed. Combined with the pickaxe your father used to murder mine still stained with his blood. You're bluffing, Ephraim snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Those things were destroyed years ago. Were they? Then why are you here digging in the middle of the night? Mason gestured toward the disturbed earth where Ephraim had been working. Looking for something that supposedly doesn't exist. Ephraim's grip tightened on the shovel. It doesn't matter what you think you know. No one will believe you over me. I am Harrison Wells. I've been Harrison Wells for 20 years. The town respects me, fears me. The territorial marshal might have a different perspective, Mason replied calmly, especially when presented with physical evidence of murder, fraud, and theft. Something shifted in Ephraim's eyes, a calculation, a decision reached. The marshal won't arrive until tomorrow, he said, his voice suddenly conversational. A lot can happen in one night. Tragic accidents, cave-ins. His gaze flickered to the tunnel entrance behind Mason. Did you come alone? A chill ran through Mason as he realized Ephraim's intent. You won't get away with any more deaths, Ephraim. Too many people know the truth now. Do they? Eleanor wouldn't dare speak against me, not while our son's future hangs in the balance. Ephraim took a step forward, shovel held like a weapon. As for the Hammond girl and her brother, well, accidents happen to Cherokee half-breeds all the time in these parts. No one asks too many questions. Fury rose in Mason's chest, hot and consuming. You'll not harm them. Not while I draw breath. That, Ephraim said softly, can be arranged. He lunged forward, suddenly swinging the shovel in a vicious arc toward Mason's head. Mason ducked the metal blade whistling past his ear. He drew his knife, backing toward the chamber entrance. He needed to lead Ephraim away from Daniel to protect the boy at all costs. Ephraim attacked again, using the shovel, like a staff, jabbing the handle toward Mason's midsection. Mason parried with his forearm, pain shooting through his arm as wood connected with bone. He slashed with his knife, opening a shallow cut across Ephraim's outstretched arm. Ephraim howled with rage, redoubling his attack. The two men grappled in the confined space, each seeking advantage, their shadows dancing grotesquely on the chamber walls in the lantern light. Though Mason was the more experienced fighter, Ephraim was younger, fueled by desperation and the knowledge that his entire life hung in the balance. The struggle carried them across the chamber, away from where Ephraim had been digging. They crashed against the opposite wall, dislodging a shower of loose rock from the ceiling. Mason felt a stab of alarm. The mine was indeed unstable, just as the warning sign had indicated. Ephraim, stop, he gasped, trying to break free. You'll bring the whole place down on us. Better that than face what's coming, Ephraim grunted, driving a knee into Mason's stomach. Mason doubled over, momentarily winded. Ephraim seized the advantage, bringing the shovel handle down across Mason's back, driving him to his knees. As Mason struggled to rise, a small voice called from the tunnel. Mr. Ridge, are you all right? I heard fighting. Daniel, the boy, had grown worried and come looking for him, despite instructions to stay put. Daniel, run, Mason shouted, desperation lending strength to his voice. Get out of the mine! But it was too late. Daniel appeared in the chamber entrance, his small face pale in the lantern light. His eyes widened as he took in the scene, Mason on his knees, Ephraim standing over him with the shovel raised for a killing blow. No, Daniel cried, rushing forward. Ephraim turned, momentarily distracted by the boy's appearance. It was all the opening Mason needed. He surged upward, driving his shoulder into Ephraim's midsection, sending them both crashing into the wall where Ephraim had been digging. The impact dislodged more than loose rocks this time. With a terrible groaning sound, the entire section of wall began to collapse, revealing the dark cavity beyond. Ephraim screamed as the ground gave way beneath him, his hands scrabbling for purchase on the crumbling edge. Mason lunged, catching Ephraim's wrist before he could fall into the darkness below. For a moment, their eyes met, Mason Wells and the man who had stolen his brother's identity. In Ephraim's gaze, Mason saw naked fear and something else, recognition. Mason! Ephraim gasped, his voice suddenly stripped of pretense. Don't let me fall. Please. The words stirred something in Mason's chest, an echo of the boy Ephraim had once been before Jeremiah Turner had twisted him into a weapon against the Wells family. For a heartbeat, Mason considered pulling him to safety. Then his gaze fell on what had been revealed by the collapsing wall, a human skeleton still clad in the tattered remains of a fine riding coat. A gold ring glinted on one bony finger. Around the skull's neck hung a tarnished pocket watch on a silver chain. Thomas Wells, his father, murdered and hidden here for 20 years. Mason's grip on Ephraim's wrist tightened. "My father," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and Jeremiah murdered him, stole his legacy, perverted everything he stood for." "It was my father, not me," Ephraim pleaded, his free hands scrabbling for better purchase. "I was just a boy. I did what I was told. And as a man, what excuse do you have for trying to hang an innocent girl for having Sarah Hammond killed, for 20 years of hatred and oppression?" Mason's voice hardened. "Your crimes are your own, Ephraim Turner." Before Ephraim could respond, more of the wall gave way. The cavity beneath them was revealed to be a natural fissure in the rock, a deep chasm with no visible bottom. Ephraim screamed as he slipped, further now dangling fully over the abyss, Mason's grip on his wrist the only thing preventing his fall. "Mason, please," he begged, real tears streaming down his face. "I have a son, Thomas, your nephew in a way. Don't let him grow up without a father." The mention of the boy innocent, uninvolved, gave Mason pause. Could he let Ephraim fall, knowing it would orphan a child? Was that justice, or merely another form of the same cruelty that had plagued Sundown Valley for generations? "Mr. Ridge," came Daniel's small voice from behind him. "Mama always said even bad people deserve mercy." In that moment, looking into the frightened eyes of his enemy and hearing the wisdom of a child, Mason made his decision. With a mighty effort, he began to pull Ephraim up from the edge of the chasm. But fate had other plans. As Ephraim's weight shifted, the ground beneath Mason's knees crumbled further. Both men cried out as they slid toward the edge, momentum carrying them into the darkness. A small hand seized the back of Mason's coat, Daniel throwing himself forward with all his might, anchoring Mason just enough to halt his slide. Mason's grip on Ephraim held, though the man now dangled fully over the chasm, nothing but air beneath his feet. "Daniel," Mason gasped, "I can't hold him much longer. The edge is giving way." "Let me help," Daniel said, his young voice steady despite the danger. He stretched out his other hand toward Ephraim. "Sir, grab my hand." Ephraim stared at the boy's outstretched hand in disbelief. Then with a desperate lunge, he reached for it. Their fingers had just touched when the last of the ledge collapsed beneath Mason. With a cry, he felt himself sliding forward, pulling Daniel with him. In that terrible moment, Mason made the only choice he could. He released Ephraim's wrist, using his now free hand to seize Daniel and roll away from the edge. Ephraim's scream echoed in the chamber as he plunged into the darkness, the sound fading until it was swallowed by distance and silence. Mason and Daniel lay trembling at the edge of the chasm. The boy clutched protectively to Mason's chest. For several long moments, neither moved. The only sound their ragged breathing and the occasional fall of disturbed rock into the depths below. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice muffled against Mason's shirt. "Is he dead?" Mason nodded, unable to find words. He had not wanted Ephraim's death, had tried to save him, even after everything. But perhaps this too was a form of justice, the earth itself reclaiming one who had built his life on lies. Carefully, they moved away from the unstable edge toward the more solid ground near the chamber entrance. Mason's gaze returned to his father's remains, still partially embedded in the wall where Ephraim had been digging. "Is that him?" Daniel asked softly. "Your father, Bamo?" "Yes," Mason replied, his voice rough with emotion. "That's Thomas Wells." Daniel approached the skeleton reverently, his small face solemn in the lantern light. "Hello, great-grandfather," he said simply. "We've come to take you home." The unexpected greeting, so childlike in its directness, yet so profound in its recognition of family bonds, brought tears to Mason's eyes. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, drawing strength from the boy's uncomplicated acceptance. "Yes," he agreed, "we're taking him home." Working carefully, they freed Thomas Wells' remains from the wall where they had been concealed for 20 years. Mason wrapped the bones in his coat, handling them with gentle reverence. The pocket watch and ring he placed in his shirt pocket close to his heart. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Daniel paused, looking back at the chasm that had claimed Ephraim Turner. "Should we try to find him too?" the boy asked. For his son, Mason considered this. The idea of attempting to recover Ephraim's body from that seemingly bottomless fissure was daunting, perhaps impossible. Yet Daniel's concern for a boy he had never met, the son of a man who had tried to destroy his family, spoke to a capacity for compassion that humbled Mason. "The chasm is too deep, too dangerous," he said finally. "But we'll tell the marshal where he fell. Perhaps with proper equipment, they can recover him later." Daniel nodded, accepting this answer. Together they made their way back through the narrow tunnel to the main shaft, Mason carrying his father's remains, while Daniel held the lantern high to light their path. The journey out of the mine seemed longer than their entry, each step weighted with the knowledge of what had occurred within those dark passages. When they finally emerged into the night air, the stars were brilliant overhead, the moon riding high. Mason took a deep breath, filling his lungs with clean, sweet air. Beside him, Daniel did the same, his small face turned upward to the heavens. "We should go find Clara," the boy said, practical as always. "Tell her what happened." Mason nodded, adjusting his precious burden. "Yes, and then we'll face whatever comes next, together." Clara paced the cabin floor, anxiety gnawing at her with each passing hour. Mason and Daniel should have returned by now. The evidence she had gathered from Eleanor Wells lay spread on the table, the pickaxe, the letters, the financial records, all damning proof of Ephraim Turner's crimes. But without Mason and Daniel, without Thomas Wells's remains, her victory felt hollow and uncertain. What if something had gone wrong at the mine? What if Ephraim had somehow learned of their plan and intercepted them? The possibilities tormented her as the night deepened. A noise outside the cabin brought her instantly alert. She seized the pickaxe, prepared to defend herself if necessary. The door swung open, and Mason stepped inside, carrying a bundle wrapped in his coat. Daniel followed, his small face smudged with dirt, but glowing with a strange, solemn pride. "Clara!" he cried, rushing to embrace his sister. "We found him. We found great-grandfather." Relief flooded through Clara at the sight of her brother safe and sound. She hugged him fiercely, then looked up at Mason, questions in her eyes. "Thomas Wells." Mason confirmed, gently placing his burden on the table. "And yes, we found him, but there's more." His weathered face was grave. "Ephraim Turner is dead." Clara's breath caught. Dead how? While Daniel busied himself washing up at the basin in the corner, and Mason recounted the confrontation in the mine, Ephraim's presence there, their fight, the collapse of the wall revealing Thomas's remains, and Ephraim's fatal fall into the chasm. "I tried to save him," Mason concluded, his voice heavy with a complex mixture of regret and grim acceptance. "Even after everything I tried." Clara placed her hand over his. "I know you did. That's who you are." They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of the night's events. Then Clara gestured to the items she had recovered from the Wells mansion. "I found everything Eleanor promised," she said. "With this and Thomas's remains, we have all we need to clear my name and reveal the truth about Sundown Valley." Mason examined the evidence, his expression growing more determined with each piece. "Tomorrow we take this to the marshal when he arrives. The truth will finally be known after 20 years of lies." Daniel joined them at the table, his face freshly scrubbed. "What happens then?" he asked. "To us, I mean." It was a question Clara had been pondering herself. With her name cleared, with the truth about the Wells and Turner families exposed, what would their place be in Sundown Valley? Would they remain facing the town's judgment and possible resentment, or would they seek a fresh start elsewhere? "That depends," Mason said, looking from Daniel to Clara. "On what you want, on what we all want." "We're family," Daniel said simply, as if that answered everything. "Aren't we?" The question hung in the air, loaded with meaning. Clara looked at Mason, this man, who had been a stranger just days ago, who had revealed himself as her half-brother, who had risked everything to save her from the gallows. Despite the decades of separation, despite the different paths their lives had taken, there was an undeniable connection between them. Blood, yes, but something more, a shared understanding, a common purpose. "Yes," she said softly, "we're family." Mason's weathered face softened, emotion flickering in his eyes. "Then perhaps that's our answer. Family stays together, helps rebuild what was broken." Clara nodded, a sense of rightness settling over her. Sundown Valley has been shaped by lies for too long. Maybe it's time for it to be guided by truth instead. "A new beginning," Mason agreed. "For the town and for us." Daniel yawned widely, the excitement and danger of the day finally catching up with him. Clara smiled, ruffling his hair. "Time for bed, little Fogs. Tomorrow will be another big day. After tucking Daniel into bed, Clara rejoined Mason by the fire. For a time, they sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. "What do you think will happen to Eleanor?" Clara asked finally. And her son, Mason, sighed, poking at the embers with a stick. "Eleanor will face difficult questions about her complicity in Ephraim's deception, but I believe she genuinely didn't know about Sarah's murder or the attempt on your life. With time, perhaps she can build a new life with her son, free from Ephraim's shadow. And the Wells fortune, the estate, with both Thomas and Ephraim gone, who inherits?" A rueful smile touched Mason's lips. "Technically, I suppose I do, as Thomas Wells's only surviving son. But I've lived without it for 20 years. I have no need for mansions or vast holdings." He glanced at Clara. "Perhaps it could be put to better use. A school, maybe, or a hospital. Something that would benefit the entire valley regardless of background or heritage." Clara smiled, warming to the idea. "My mother would have liked that, using the Wells wealth to bridge the divisions that have separated people for so long." "It's what my father would have wanted too," Mason said quietly. "He believed in equality and respect for all people. Rebuilding Sundown Valley according to those principles would be the best memorial for him and for your mother." They continued talking late into the night, making plans, sharing memories, beginning the process of knitting together their separate lives into a shared future. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and wild herbs through the open window. Morning would bring the marshal the revelation of long-buried truths, the beginning of justice for those who had been silenced. But for now, in this quiet cabin on the ridge, a new kind of family had formed from the broken pieces of the old, not perfect, not without its scars and sorrows, but genuine in a way that transcended blood and embraced choice. The territorial marshal arrived shortly before noon the following day, his weathered face impassive as Mason and Clara presented their evidence. Thomas Wells's remains laid out with dignity on a clean sheet, the pickaxe with its damning bloodstains. Sarah Hammond's journal with its meticulous documentation of Jeremiah and Ephraim Turner's crimes. The letter's financial records and birth certificate establishing the real Harrison Wells's identity and his father's murder. Marshal James Thornton, a man known for his uncompromising pursuit of justice, examined each piece of evidence with methodical care. He asked precise, sometimes uncomfortable questions that Clara and Mason answered as truthfully as they could. Daniel sat quietly in the corner, watching the proceedings with solemn eyes. "This is the most extraordinary case I've encountered in 30 years of law enforcement," Thornton said, finally setting aside the last document. "Murder, identity theft, fraud on a massive scale, spanning decades and touching every aspect of this town's life." He fixed Mason with a penetrating stare. "And you say Ephraim Turner fell to his death in the mine last night?" "Yes, sir," Mason confirmed, "while attempting to remove my father's remains and attacking us when we discovered him." Thornton nodded, making a note in his leather-bound book. "We'll need to recover the body if possible. For the record." "The chasm appeared very deep," Mason cautioned. "It may not be possible to reach him." "Nevertheless, we'll try." The marshal closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "In the meantime, I'm placing the Wells estate and all associated properties under government control pending a full investigation. Miss Hammond, you are officially cleared of all charges in Jacob Miller's death. The evidence clearly indicates Ephraim Turner was responsible, likely to silence Miller after he discovered something in the stable records." Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders at these words. No longer a fugitive, no longer under threat of the gallows. "Thank you, Marshal." "Don't thank me yet," Thornton warned. "This case will be messy, very public, and potentially dangerous. There are powerful people connected to the Turner family who won't appreciate these revelations." He glanced at Mason. "And your reappearance after 20 years presumed dead raises its own legal complications, Mr. Wells." Mason accepted this with a nod. "I understand. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences come from my actions, past and present." "Good." Thornton gathered the evidence, securing it in his saddlebags. "I'll return to the territorial capital today with this evidence and dispatch deputies to begin a full investigation. In the meantime, I suggest you all remain vigilant. News of Ephraim Turner's death will spread quickly, and there may be those who blame you regardless of the circumstances." After the marshal departed, Clara, Mason, and Daniel sat together at the cabin table, the enormity of what had transpired finally beginning to sink in. "It's over," Clara said softly, almost disbelieving. The truth is out. Mama's killer has faced justice. Well, not over, Mason corrected gently. Just beginning. The town will need time to process these revelations to understand how thoroughly they've been deceived. There will be resistance, denial, anger. But there will be healing too, Clara added, her gaze moving to the window where Sundown Valley spread below, bathed in midday sunlight. For the first time in decades, people can live without the shadow of lies hanging over them. Daniel, practical as always, asked the question uppermost in his mind. Where will we live now, our cabin or here with Mr. Ridge? I mean, Uncle Mason. The question brought a smile to both adults' faces. Uncle Mason, Shemaya, the older man repeated as if testing how the words felt. I think I could get used to that. As for where we'll live, Clara said, I think that's something we need to decide together. Our old cabin is small, but it's home. This ridge is beautiful, but far from town. Perhaps neither, Mason suggested. The Wells estate will eventually need new occupants once the legal matters are settled. Who better than Thomas Wells's son and grandchildren? Clara raised an eyebrow. You would want to live in that house after everything. Not as it is, Mason acknowledged, but reimagined, repurposed. A place of welcome rather than exclusion. A home rather than a monument to wealth and privilege. He looked from Clara to Daniel. We could make it whatever we want it to be. The idea was startling, but not without appeal. Clara tried to imagine herself in that grand house, walking corridors that had once been forbidden to her kind. There was a certain poetic justice to it, the daughter of a Cherokee woman, and the son she had been told was dead reclaiming their rightful place. We'll see, she said, not committing, but not refusing either. For now we have more immediate concerns. Chief among these was Thomas Wells's proper burial. Over the next few days, with Reverend Abernathy's assistance, they prepared for a simple but dignified funeral. Word spread throughout the valley about the extraordinary revelations, the return of the long-lost Mason Wells, the exposure of Ephraim Turner's decades of deception, the recovery of Thomas Wells' remains. Reactions varied widely. Some refused to believe, clinging to the version of history they had accepted for 20 years. Others, particularly those who had suffered under Harrison Wells' discriminatory policies, found vindication in the truth. Many simply watched and waited, unsure where their loyalties should now lie. Eleanor Wells emerged from seclusion to attend Thomas's funeral, her face composed but her eyes red-rimmed from weeping. She approached Clara afterward, her elegant hands clasped tightly before her. I owe you an apology, she said quietly, for my silence, for my complicity. I can offer explanations, but not excuses. Clara studied the older woman, seeing both the privilege that had shaped her and the courage it had taken to finally break free of Ephraim's control. You helped us in the end, she acknowledged. Without your assistance, we might never have found the evidence we needed. Small atonement for years of cowardice. Eleanor's gaze drifted to where Mason stood speaking with the Reverend. He is so like his father. Thomas had that same quiet strength, that same moral center. She looked back at Clara. What will you do now? Will you stay in Sundown Valley? It was the question everyone seemed to be asking, including Clara herself. I think so, she said slowly. This is home despite everything, and there's work to be done here, healing that's needed. Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. If I can help in that work, I would like to. For my son's sake, if nothing else. I want him to return to a town built on truth rather than lies. The mention of young Thomas reminded Clara of something Mason had said in the mine. Your son, he's Mason's nephew in a way. Family, however, complicated the connection. A sad smile touched Eleanor's lips. Yes, family, something Ephraim never truly understood the value of, despite his obsession with the Wells name. She straightened her shoulders. I'll be leaving for Boston tomorrow to bring Thomas home. When we return, perhaps we might begin again. Not forgetting the past, but not imprisoned by it either. Clara nodded, feeling a cautious optimism. I'd like that. In the days that followed, life in Sundown Valley began its slow adjustment to the new reality. The territorial government appointed a temporary mayor until proper elections could be held. The Wells mansion stood empty, awaiting decisions about its future ownership. Mason, Clara, and Daniel settled into a routine, dividing their time between the Ridge cabin and the Hammond home, beginning to forge their new life as a family. One evening, as summer gave way to early autumn, They sat on the porch of the ridge cabin, watching the sunset paint the valley in hues of gold and purple. Daniel had fallen asleep in Clara's lap, exhausted from a day of helping Ezra Johnson at the blacksmith shop, where he had shown an unexpected aptitude for metalwork. "He's growing so fast," Clara murmured, stroking her brother's hair. "Sometimes I forget he's only 9. He's had to be so much older." "Children are resilient," Mason observed, "more so than adults sometimes. They adapt, they heal." He glanced at Clara. "As do we, given time and truth." Clara nodded, her gaze on the distant town where lights were beginning to twinkle as darkness fell. "I've been thinking about what you said about the Wells estate, about making it something new." Mason raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "Mama always wanted to start a school," Clara said slowly. "Not just for Cherokee children, but for anyone willing to learn. A place where healing arts would be taught alongside reading and figures, where the old ways and the new could exist together." "Sarah's school," Mason mused, warming to the idea. "Built on Wells land, funded by Wells money, but honoring your mother's vision." "Our mother's vision," Clara corrected gently. "She was your family too, through my father." Mason's weathered face softened with emotion. "Yes, our mother." He cleared his throat. "I think it's a fine idea. A way to bring healing to the valley, to bridge the divisions that have separated people for too long." Clara smiled, feeling a sense of rightness settle over her. "Then that's what we'll do. Together." As darkness fell, completely stars appeared one by one in the velvet sky. Below in the valley, Sundown Hollow slept its dreams, perhaps troubled by recent revelations, but with the promise of a new day to come. Clara thought of her mother, of the truth she had preserved at the cost of her life, of Thomas Wells, who had loved across boundaries of race and class, who had been killed for his vision of a more just world, of the real Harrison Blackfeather Wells, who had died too young, his potential unrealized. Their stories would be remembered now, their truths acknowledged, and from the broken pieces of the past, something new would be built, a future shaped by honesty rather than deception, by inclusion rather than hatred, by family bonds forged through choice as well as blood. The curse of Sundown Valley had been broken at last. What would grow in its place remained to be seen. But as Clara sat between her brother and her newly found uncle, watching the stars emerge above the valley that had nearly taken her life, but was now offering a new beginning, she felt something she had not experienced in a very long time: hope. Not a blind, naive hope that ignored the challenges ahead, but a clear-eyed, determined hope that acknowledged the work still to be done and committed to doing it, one day at a time, one truth at a time, one healing connection at a time. "Home," she whispered, the word carried away on the gentle night breeze. "We're home."